Good. All right. Welcome, everybody out there. Meeting's called to order here at 6:01. 5:33. What am I so used to? 14 years of saying 6:01. Sorry. All right. That may not be the only mistake tonight I make. May we have the roll call, please, Lindsay?
Chairperson Philip Goldstein,
Here.
Vice Chairperson Marty Jost,
Here.
Commissioner Tom Wood,
Here.
Commissioner Wendy Newland, Commissioner Michael Lowry,
Here.
Alternate Commissioner Renzo Bianchi,
Here.
Alternate Commissioner Janelle Mines. Here. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners, any amendments to the agenda? All right. Determination of alternate voting, not necessary. We've got all the regular commissioners here. Public comment. I presume there's nobody here that wishes to speak on something that's not on the agenda. So I'm opening and closing the general public comment. The consent agenda consists only of approval of the May 6th, 2025 meeting minutes. Commissioners, staff, at all, anybody, any additions or corrections to the minutes? Hearing none, do I have a motion on the item number 5, the consent agenda?
Motion to approve the consent agenda.
I have a second.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the consent agenda. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries on a 5-0 vote. We jump to public hearing business item number 7, 7A, parking space dimensions, land use code amendment. Troy Jones.
There we go. Good evening. I am Troy Jones, as you know, and I've got 3 items on the agenda this evening. Parking space dimensions is the first one. Building color is the second one, and building height is the third one. The building height, as we were preparing the PowerPoint show, I was making a lot of diagrams to try to diagram out exactly how the stories and existing codes feet kind of correlate. And as we were kind of diving into that, we decided maybe we needed to refine it a little bit as we learned a little bit more from the, from the diagrams. So I have some revised code language for that one that I would like to pass out. So Logan's going to pass those out. So I'll get started with the parking space dimensions. The third item is the one that is affected by the revised code language. And when you get to that, I put the color green on there for the new text that is, since you've received the packet. There's just a few minor changes, but I think they were necessary in order to be consistent with, what our intent was as we really dove into a few more details at the last minute. So with regard to parking space dimensions, we want to add a new subsection, 5.8.19. Let's see, where's the advancer? There we go. So first, why are we doing this? Well, currently we don't have any parking space dimensions in the Timnath land use code, but the land use code does defer or refer the reader to Larimer County Urban Area Street Standards. And Larimer County Urban Area Street Standards has this figure 19.7 that regulates parking stall width. And so by default, this is already what we've been applying. So we just thought it would be cleaner to have it in our code. So what we ended up doing was just using these same numbers in this diagram. And then we gave it a little bit more thought on what is a compact vehicle and when is it appropriate to have compact vehicle spaces, right? And Lucas was a little vague on that. They just gave standard vehicle spaces and compact vehicle space sizes, but they didn't really go into a lot of detail as to why you do one over the other and when. And so we gave it some more thought and did a little research on what's the percentage of compact cars out there today in the cars that are in use. And from several different sources, it was hovering right around 20% as the compact car sizes, and then obviously 80% are somewhat larger than compact cars. And then we gave a little thought to when would it be appropriate for compact spaces to be used? Not in a retail scenario typically, because you got a lot of turnover. So you might have a small car there, but then 15 minutes later, a big vehicle might want to come into a space. So we kind of came up with the term, and we learned a little bit from looking at some other codes in the area, but long-term parking lots for like office buildings or for like apartment buildings, you don't get a lot of turnover. So that's where we sort of ended up with like the 20% maximum that a person could choose to do in their development would be only in long-term parking space or parking lots, which would be, for example, like I said, the office or the apartment building parking lots. Otherwise, and that's just voluntary. Only if a applicant wants to do it. There's no requirement to do compact parking stalls. I think there was a question out there in the public. We did a little public outreach meeting for all three of these, in addition to the one that Logan's going to talk to you about, and that was one of the feedbacks we got was, is this required? And no, it's just voluntary. So this is kind of where we ended up, this is in your packet as well. Within the proposed code language on the attachment to the staff report, and so we can come back to this if you have any questions on that. But another thing we sort of looked at was, well, we got a little feedback that, well, maybe the sizes that we're saying are a little bit too small, and we gave it a little more research, and we kind of looked around the area, and we looked at Greeley, which we hadn't looked at prior to that, and saw that they've got similar sizes, but they're a little bit smaller in a few dimensions. And so we're thinking maybe the Lucas standards were right on the money where we need to be, but obviously we're just recommending to you, and then you recommend to council, and so this is an opportunity for discussion. Are these the right sizes or not? And so that's really the parking space dimension code change that we're considering.
Troy, I'm jumping here where I normally don't. We're going to take these one at a time.
Okay.
If that's okay.
Sure.
Hard pressed to read this, and I'm not sure anybody can read it up there. Would you go through these dimensions for us, the most pertinent
the ones that we're proposing?
Yes.
Yeah, this is a little easier to read. This other one that on this other page was just to show you that we looked at Greeley so there's kind of the upper diagram on this slide shows you the what the columns A through H on each of these charts represent. And so it depends on whether you've got a parallel spot or three different diagonal angled spots or a complete 90-degree head-in spot as to what the dimensions would be. Geometrically, as it becomes different, whether it's parallel head in or the various angles, you need a little bit more room because of the just the angle that the ground that the angle would eat up. And in the case of parallel, obviously you've got, the front bumper and the back bumper of every car, one in front of the other. So, do you want me to go through each column or?
Well, start with the pertinent ones and we'll dive into
Right, so
the
the
less
standard
pertinent
vehicle is
ones.
probably the main one to go through. So if you've got a parallel parking scenario, you're kind of starting up here at the top left of the standard vehicle parking table. It would be 8 feet wide. You'd have 23 feet long, bumper to bumper, basically. The D dimension is, C and D in this case are the same, but once you get to the diagonal, it becomes different dimensions. The E dimension is also only pertinent really. Let's see, it's the same as the C dimension in this case because it only changes in the diagonal, and then the F and the G are whether you've got a let's see, the G is the one-way drive, or if it's just a single loaded drive, and then the G, excuse me, I got that backwards. The F is the two-way drive. So if you've got traffic going both directions in your drive aisle and that's going into the parking stalls, or the G is if it's just a one-way drive aisle, or if it's single loaded. And then we sort of added this bumper overhang. It was a footnote in the Lucas standards, but we made it one of this column H, so to make it a little more clear. So you can reduce the spaces by that amount if you've. Well, no, how does that read? No, that's just the amount of bumper overhang you have to consider that you have in front of the spot.
Okay, I
on
think
that column H.
again, let's take the most important elements. I think width
Width.
is probably the
Yeah,
thing that
so-
one has, people have most interest in. So let's summarize that
Yeah.
first.
Yeah, so it goes from a parallel parking spot at 8 feet wide to, the 30-degree and the 45-degree at 8.5 feet wide. The 60-degree angled parking is 9 feet wide, and so is the head-in parking. And that just came to, like I said, straight from Lucas standards, Larimer County Urban Area Street Standards. Then on the compact vehicles, so those potential 20%, it would be narrower. So you'd anywhere from the parallel 30 and 45% is 7.5 feet wide on the compact spaces. And the 60-degree and the head-in 90-degree would be 8 feet wide.
Okay, we're obliged to have public comment on this, and we're going to follow normal standards, and we'll bring it up here for comments. Do we have anybody signed up for public comment? Nothing? All right. So we close the public comment on this. Commissioners, who would like to go first here? Turn your microphone on, please, and talk into it. Thank you.
Yeah, I just have a couple questions. One question was, you said you compared to all these others. How's the width of this and the depth compared to, say, like the Costco parking lot? Parking.
Yeah, this is narrower than Costco, and this doesn't prohibit anybody from making bigger parking spaces. This is just saying this is the minimum size that you have to do if you're making a parking lot. But yeah, Costco chose to make them a lot bigger, and like for example in Ladera, we've been talking to the developers there, and they've got a user that wants to make parking spaces bigger than this as well, and there's nothing in this that would prohibit them from doing that.
And then how about down in Old Town, the parking that we have? How's that
Yeah, I
graded?
know.
Because if I recall,
Either
that's been
I haven't looked at that
of
specifically.
You're talking about Old Town Fort Collins, Old
No,
Town,
I'm sorry.
or Old Town
Old-
Timnath?
Old Town Timnath,
Sorry.
that diagonal parking. Presumably they use the Lucas standards, which would be the same as what we're proposing, but we could certainly follow up on that, after this meeting, if you'd like.
And then my last question is, the planner having that 10% on there, what's the criteria to allow it up to that? Because that seems like if I'm understanding all this correctly, you know, especially if I have that 2-lane and I've got the 20 feet between the two, I can reduce that down to 16 feet. I'm sorry, to 18 feet. And so what's the criteria by which that'll be made of how much that can be reduced? And should we
Yeah, I'm trying to. refresh
specify
my
what that
memory.
criteria is in here?
Yeah, that's a question that I think we just inherited from the Lucas. Let's just double check this. Where did that come from?
Are you talking about the
No.
variance, the
Yes.
allowance?
So there's that asterisk, yeah, at the bottom of both table A and table B that says these minimum dimensions may be varied by up to 10% with the approval of the town planner. Which would be, you know, Scott and in his role. Yeah, we didn't set up any criteria for that. I guess it would, you know, be more of a, if it's
point.
justified and it makes sense to the town planner.
Is that 10% up, 10% down? What is, which is
Well,
it?
it would,
What's your?
there's
guess
nothing
for the
preventing
extension?
them from making them bigger, so it would presumably just be down then. I mean, you could make them smaller if the town planner agreed to make them smaller.
I'd rather hear everybody else and then come back, for
Okay.
me, come back this, but where Renzo's going is where I was going to go too, seeing this in a couple. Yeah, I'm going to, on the same track and another track.
Yeah.
So, Renzo, is that,
No,
We'll come back.
you've got it.
okay?
You've got where I'm
What
going.
else, other, let's come, we'll come, I want to come back to this and hear everything else. If we could, please. Wendy?
So Troy, did I hear you say that you compared it to Greeley and ours is a little bit bigger?
Right, yeah, so this, I apologize for the graphic on this, but the Greeley, their stall widths are the same as
Okay.
Lucas. But it's the aisle widths between, you know, the one-way aisle widths can be a little bit smaller than what our standards and Lucas would allow. And then it was also, let's see, what the like curb width dimension that it's just is in a few instances a little bit smaller.
Okay, so the stalls are
But the stall
same.
itself, right,
Okay.
is virtually the same in
but
Greeley.
the
yeah,
driving in
right,
between. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to
Yeah.
make sure I understood that. Thanks.
right. Yeah, the depth.
I've got a
and-
question.
Tom?
Too. Troy, I really appreciate all that you've gone through with this, and this has been a little bit of a pet peeve for myself. Most of the Larimer County regulations actually come from the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, or MUDCO. And I've noticed in the differences between Greeley and Larimer County, Greeley is following the 2009 version of that document, whereas I believe the Larimer County has upgraded to the 2015 version of that document. So that may be why some of the changes are.
Mhm.
But I've done a few things maybe on my own, and I apologize, Phil, if I've gone overboard. I went around and I did a survey of 20 different parking lots in Timnath, and I measured every parking space or a number statistically equivalent to those parking spaces. And I found that the average parking space in Timnath is about 8.5 feet. It's actually 8.7, 8 feet, 7 inches. And I've compared the parking spaces in this lot, across the street, all around the post office, Walmart, Costco, the elementary schools, the post office. I mean, I've gone all over the city trying to find them. Basically, there's little or no spaces that are 8 feet. The only ones that are less than 8 feet actually are across the street in the apartment complex, which has had a parking issue for a long time. They're actually 7.5 feet. They would meet your compact size,
Yeah.
but all of them are
Ooh.
7.5 feet. So even the big trucks are hanging out, and that's leading to a lot of people parking out on Stonefly Drive, where along the edge of Stonefly Drive, the city has striped the streets at 7 feet. So we'd have to go back and restripe the streets if we approve this 8-foot minimum. And that would take into account the smaller bicycle lanes if we had to do that. So I think we need to think of the impact of some of these rules. nationally, the average is between 8.5 and 9 feet. If you go to the state of Wyoming, the entire state of Wyoming is 9 feet. So I think we need to really think about, is 8 foot too small? I think that the original MUTCO requirements were focused on municipal parking in cities like Denver. And that's why Port Collins and Larimer County, I think, adopted those requirements. We are not a municipal or a city, we're a suburb. And if you look at other places, if you compare us to Greenwood Village, for example, their minimums are 9 feet. So I think that we should seriously think about, is 8 feet too small? I'd propose 8.5 because that's what we are existing right now. And I think representing the people and the residents of Timnath, we should probably not encumber them with too many small parking spaces. There's a large number of larger vehicles, I think, in the town. I'm not sure where you came up with your 20% compact cars, but I think there's a larger number of minivans and families with Suburbans and pickup trucks and so forth. I think we should be more mindful of what the residents of Timnath really want or need.
I mean,
And when you say 8.5, are you referring to the parallel, or excuse me,
The parallel parking, if you go over to
Parallel
Walmart
parking.
where they have mostly parallel parking, those are 9 feet wide.
you mean, well, that's the perpendicular. We've got it at 9 feet,
Yes.
like the head-in parking, if you look
But I
at the
think
chart.
it's the
It's
8
showing 9
foot
feet.
wide parallel parking.
Right, so
That's
that,
the one that I'm most concerned about.
okay, so
because
you're
most of
thinking
our
that needs to be
streets
at
are
least
parallel
8.5, okay.
And most MUDCO is not applicable to private developments, private parking lots of any kind. It's only set up for municipal public places that are not privately owned. So, for example, across the street, the commercial things, those are all 8.7 feet or 8 feet 7 inches. Even the town here averages 8.7 inches. If you talk to the American Asphalt Association, they recommend between 8.5 and 9. Most of the asphalt places, I talked to 3 different asphalt companies in Larimer County. They are all, their standard design is 8.5.
hang on one second. Okay, lest we go too far, because I get the sense of Scott wants to interject something, and maybe if I'm putting you on the spot, and he was looking over at Justin, who I'm putting on the spot too, but let's take this issue by issue first. So go ahead, Scott.
Well, I was trying to, Commissioner Wood, thanks for all your research in MUTCD. Yes, you are maybe conflicting some different standards and codes. So point number 1, currently the land use code references our technical design criteria, which we adopt Lucas standards, which regulate standards on public streets. MUTCD are standards for public streets. Land use code parking amendments are minimums that are establishing a baseline. These are minimums. Most of the places that you referenced are private parking areas that people chose to be more than the minimums. And I was just looking at Justin to help clarify the difference between MUTCD and Lucas standards. Because they're not necessarily the same thing, but I want my engineer to kind of weigh in on that because
Sure.
I don't want them to be confused to what the both are typically trying to achieve. Generally, and I'm going to set Justin up because he can tell me if I'm wrong, it's traffic control devices. So MUTCD looks at pavement markings and signage for traffic control purposes. And so when you do on-street parking, that's a little bit different than private parking. So Justin.
Yeah, I was going to say Scott's correct. There's 2 different codes and they're applied differently. So the MUTCD are the manual uniform traffic control devices. I mean, they got to be consistent. I mean, it makes sense, but this is geared more for your parking lot. If you look the layout, it's parking lot layout, which is different than a street where you're just coming in and then pulling in. So those standards are a little bit different. Also, you have with a street, you have what's called the pan for you have a drainage pan. So part of that is also, so it may seem when you measure the width that if you measure what's called the flow line. Oh, you did? Okay, yeah.
7 feet on Stonefly across from the fire station and all the way down Rendezvous Parkway.
Yeah. And then so those can actually, I think I'd have to go back and look at the code. Some of those could be actually in urban areas could be down to, I think 8 feet total or what's called the NACTO guidelines. You could go actually in like urban areas a little bit tighter than that. So that's more your downtowns, like you said, Denver,
Is this
Old
an
Town
urban
Street.
area,
So
Justin?
what's that?
Are we an urban area or suburban area?
Well, I mean, if you look at Old Town, you could really think of that as a kind of an Old Town or like more
The parallel spaces in Old
urban,
Town are
like
eight
an
and a half.
urban,
Okay,
urban
let him
section.
finish, please.
So basically like Matt or what Scott said, this is going to be the land use code. So we still going to apply the MUTCD for our streets. Those still govern. We still have to sign that. So what you're talking about tonight is more for private parking lots, land use code. So the land use code does not dictate anything on public right of ways. So it is a different context that you're looking at.
Fair enough.
So,
I know if we're going to follow the Larimer County and Larimer County has adopted the manual, are we doing ourselves a disservice by having our minimum too small?
speak to that, please.
Well, our position is no, because we're establishing a minimum and making it a clearer standard than referencing a document that lives outside of the local control. Again, we adopt the Lucas area standards. Now by bringing this in the land use code, we have that ability to amend and change as we desire moving forward. So we're establishing a baseline. If you're not happy with that being bigger, we can make the minimum bigger, but again, we're establishing a baseline. And of course, the asphalt, people probably would like to have more pavement for their things. So I think there's things that we have to balance in regards to impervious surface, runoff. How do you manage runoff and making sure it's not too hot? And there's a lot of things that come into parking that are probably a little bit more complicated than just accommodating large vehicles, but that's things that we are taking in consideration for the minimum standard.
I want to ask a couple questions and maybe
Go ahead.
we'll breathe here for a minute. I presume if you're going to make the on-street parallel parking wider, you're going to push the bike lane further out into
This is
traffic.
not on street. We're not talking about public streets. This is on-site parking standards. We're not
Right.
talking about
Well,
streets.
you mentioned parallel parking was your biggest.
We're doing a lot of parallel parking out on
This
Stonefly.
does not in fact
Yeah.
on-street standards. I cannot say it one more time. This is
That's-
on-site standards,
That's,
period.
yeah, that's the point I was getting to. We're really mixing apples and oranges here, correct?
Correct, yes. And so whatever was measured in the street, I don't know what standard they use, but the town has to follow MUTC guidelines and standards and what those streets are. I know urban, it really has nothing to do with urban. It's just what the standards are and those minimums. So this is for private property parking standards.
My next other question is, and I'm going to go back, I'm going to circle back because Renzo brought it up. And I was thinking this in a different context. The variance issue, first of all, if we have, again, maybe I'm all wet. It's no issue about 10% variance up because there's no, and you can go up. When you go down, aren't we then in conflict with the long-term parking? I mean, how realistically are we likely to ever exercise the variance issue? Because I got the impression somehow that you picked this up, not necessarily part of the Larimer County standards. In other words, do they offer this variance provision as well?
Let me scroll to that diagram. I think they don't. I think we came up with this. I know we had batted this around in staff. I'm trying to remember when and where we decided to do that, but I don't think it was from Lucas.
Well, I think one application would be any sort of infill development, perhaps in Old Town where you're a little more constrained and perhaps they need to come up with a creative solution. That's where a 10% variance would come in.
Yeah, go ahead, Scott, please.
So, and in my prior job, this situation would come up sometimes where, again, depending on the use. So staff has proposed kind of your short-term, high turnover parking where I don't think this would apply too much, but when you're looking at a long-term situation where you're not getting a lot of movement in those aisles, I could see a petitioner coming in and saying, hey, in this area that we might be constrained, maybe that drive aisle needs to be reduced by the 10% because we're not seeing, you're not seeing a lot of activity in that area. So that could be a consideration. I don't think generally you would be looking at a carte blanche the entire site. It's usually very site specific on the parking area where maybe a drive aisle, a certain area, the parking area might need a little bit of a wiggle room. But in my experience, I haven't seen like a carte blanche. The entire site is looking for those sort of waivers, I guess, or deviations in the minimums.
Which kind of goes to what my next element of this. Do we at present have any what would qualify as long-term parking, hence allowable of a narrower space?
Well, presumably those apartments that were referred to, I mean, that's maybe why there's, I mean, if, it was built before any of us staff were here, so it was just guessing, but that is the scenario where it's long-term because you don't get a lot of turnover as you do in retail with an apartment complex, and an office complex would be kind of a similar scenario. You might get once or twice a day a different car in the same spot, whereas Costco parking lot, for example, you probably get 50 cars in one spot in a given day.
So speaking somewhat, I think to Tom's somewhat, and maybe back to Renzo, if we enact these standards as you're proposing, if that apartment complex wasn't there and was proposed, would they have had to have wider spaces? Or
Well,
would they be allowed to have the same?
If what
the
Tom's
apartment
measurements
complex
indicate,
to the west of
it's
here?
smaller than what would be allowed with these minimums. Yeah, so
Yeah.
they would have had to have 80% standard spaces, which would have been 9 feet wide minimum. And they could have done up to 20% compact, which would have been, if they're head in, that is 90-degree spaces, they could have been up to 8 feet wide, or no narrower than 8 feet wide.
Not up to, but I'm just asking if it was starting all over again, we adopt these standards.
Yeah.
Would their spaces have to be wider?
Wider
or
than they
They would have to
currently
be
are.
wider than they are now.
According to Tom's measurements, yeah, they
Yeah.
would have to be 80% of the lot would have to be 9 feet wide, and they could choose to do up to 20% of their lot at 8 feet wide.
Yeah, the one part of, I think of Tom's.
With these standards.
At least one, fairness, to Tom's point is, we do have an issue over there. I don't know that it's entirely related, but the issue would be worse with more parking out on the street than it is now. If they had wider spaces, they'd have less cars, there'd be more cars out on the street. So I don't know if that
Well,
presents any
if the
tacit
development
logic here, but
came in from scratch, though, they probably wouldn't have been able to squeeze as many units on if they would have had to have bigger parking spaces.
that too. Yes, well, there was much about that in retrospect. I was here, but certainly not taking credit for.
And I suspect that's why they have the mess over there that they do. And my son lives there. It is a constant mess.
Yeah.
And all we were talking about at the time is the number of spots. And given that there was no standards, they make them all unusable to fit in the number of spots.
Yeah.
Commissioners, other questions? I got a couple more, but I'll come back. Michael.
I just have concerns. I think we're putting a lot of trust in people to say, I've got a compact car and trying to squeeze it in and just leading to a lot of door dings and just uncomfortable parking. So I'm somewhat reluctant to lower, tighten the spaces up just because I think we're trusting people too easily. So that's
And my guess is it's not enforced much.
I can't see there being enforcement. Private property parking's not enforceable.
Yeah, people park in the EV spots all the time. And
EV charging places are required to be 9 feet wide.
well, regardless, people park in there that, If
So let's, let's,
1960s going
let's
down.
take this long-term issue just as expeditiously as possible because we've got a long agenda. Any staff, any further thoughts on the consensus, at least on the left side of the table, not the right, on the long-term parking issue? Any thoughts on, and given that we don't presently have it,
Yeah.
I will say, but before you answer my question or speak to it, I do applaud you for being proactive instead of waiting until somebody makes a case for it and then we come back to it. So I think, but go ahead with any thoughts you have.
It seems like that example of the apartments across the street is a good one as to why to put some minimums in the code. Why now, I guess. The question when you do your motion and ultimately vote would be, is what we're showing for the regular stall, the standard stall width, and what we're showing for the compact width, something you would recommend to council, or do you have a alternate number that, your motion wants to suggest? From staff standpoint, we're comfortable with what Lucas gave us as an example, but, ultimately the recommendation is up to you all.
Well, I have no strong feeling, but if enough commissioners feel that and I assume there's some compromise, the long-term parking could be somewhat smaller than, but not quite as small as what the Lucas standards are. Is there any?
Yeah, and as a reminder, the standard spots are 9 feet wide when it's head in this draft, and the compact is 8 feet wide in this draft.
And it's just an allowance. We're just giving an alternative allowance. They don't have to put in compact parking spaces.
I realize that because it as evidenced by the fact we don't have any now. I don't know that it rises to much ado about nothing. Like I said, I think it's good to be thinking that way, anticipating, and of course, we all remember these are all living documents. We can change it at any point. So commissioners, to move this along, are you comfortable with the 8 feet here? Or do you want to propose something different?
I'm not sure why it's needed. If there's that 10% variance in there, if somebody wanted to do this, they could just ask for a variance, and that's within the 10, barely, maybe a few inches away from the variance. So I'm not sure why the compact piece is even needed.
Scott, you'd be approving the variance presumably. Any thoughts on, does that cover it?
I mean, me personally, I like to have something to base a decision on. So having a standard for compact, like rather than just saying, oh, we just have regular, we want to do some at compact, it's nice to have something to base it upon rather than just a 10%, like I said, a carte blanche. So generally how I'd approach things is like where and how much. So I would anticipate that in that scenario, if we didn't do what I'm assuming, Marty, is that we wouldn't do the compact, the 10% would just give that compact light assumption. That I would prefer that you would motion in the sense that the maybe put a limitation on what that 10% would be with the intent for compact parking rather than just the aisle like I talked about.
Yeah, I guess.
I'd like to have some guardrails,
Yeah,
I guess, and
yeah.
it gives better expectation
Yeah.
from the petitioner, because if they say, hey, I just want to do 10%
No,
everywhere,
yeah.
then we might end up with a situation
Yeah.
across the street.
Yeah.
I don't want to be in that situation. I'd rather have a standard to base it upon.
I get it, because,
ahead.
I mean, otherwise somebody would just do the compacts, just
Right,
meet
so-
the
so
number
I-
of parking spaces. So if we did that and it's still 20% max,
So I think what this does, at least gives some guardrails on what that
yeah.
provides.
I would prefer I would prefer a set standard, even if it has to be adjusted later, but I don't think the variance is a way to go with this one.
At one point of clarification on that 10%, that asterisk is only in columns F and G, and it's both on the standard and the compact tables. But columns F and G is just the drive aisle width.
Go back to the previous, would you go
And that
back
was
to,
my concern.
hang on a second, good, just a second. Would you go back to the previous table? Because so you can
yeah, on
read
the
what F
screen.
and G is, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so F and G on both of the tables are the drive aisle width. So the space, the parking space dimensions aren't affected by this 10% variance. It's only the drive aisle width,
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up.
the way
Now,
that it's
does
written.
that speak to your
No,
original?
that's why I was concerned, is because the drive aisleways is my backup space, and if I have a deeper space and you squish my aisleway, then I have prones of either hitting something while I'm backing up. So that's why I was asking on that 10%, what's the criteria for saying, yes, you can reduce it by the 10%? Because if it was 20 feet, now.
Talk on the microphone, if you would, please,
Oh.
just so.
Because I've now reduced it down to 18 feet, so that's all I was getting at. I understood it was the aisleway.
Okay, we're good with the variance. Thanks for going the extra mile on that one. All right, commissioners, any other, well, we gotta solve the long-term parking,
One point, if I may
please.
ask. If I understood them correctly, this is exactly what we're following today. All we're doing is documenting it, lifting it from what Larimer County had and putting it into our code. So if we have it today, why can't we go forward with it? And as you said, this is a living document. If we decide we don't need it or want to make an amendment, we do that in a future one.
Well, we don't have any standards right now, so yeah, but I catch your drift. What we are doing is putting standards in place, but I agree with your conclusion. If everybody agrees with your conclusion.
I worry that once we have a standard in place, it's not going to be easy to change.
We're making changes.
Making changes.
The rest of what's on there tonight were changes that we're making, so we have that ability to bring it up. I want to ask this, meant to ask, how many, and I think it's in yours, how many communities of all the communities in Larimer County follow these same or higher standards?
You mean
It's
the
all-
Lucas standards?
Yeah,
or
it's most of them,
Yeah, I
right?
mean, primarily Loveland and Fort Collins, but some of the smaller towns such as Timnath and use Lucas standards. But gosh, I think Wellington uses them as well, from what I've heard. Estes Park, I think, as well.
Okay.
But that's exclusive to Larimer County, so there's just, I'm not sure if Bertha does or not. I know that's in Larimer County, but
All right, well, are we stuck on the long-term parking, even though right now, are we stuck on that or are we not? Nobody's gonna step up. Okay. I think then I'm gonna propose, somebody wants to make a motion. Unless somebody wants to suggest an amendment to a condition or an amendment to the standard that's in the amendment.
So don't we, from the very start of the conversation, don't we have to add some language to clarify the criteria, the 10% thing?
Thought it was clarified.
But there was questions about that I didn't hear an answer to.
yeah, that was, Scott said that might be useful rather than a blanket giving him that authority, but that's currently not in this language.
I
No,
don't
I
think that's
was-
what
I
you're
was-
talking about, is it?
I was talking in context to I misspoke because I didn't realize it was dealing with just the drive aisle width. So, and I think what Marty was talking about is they could just use that 10% to arrive at a compact dimension for all the spaces. So that's
Very
what,
beginning,
that's what my
not-
comment
yeah.
was.
Not what I said.
No, I
Very
just said-
beginning, on this 10%, it was, I think it was the first thing brought up, that it sounded like there was some definition that needed to be added there. So if not, that's fine. It just, to me, it was an open question.
Yeah, I didn't catch.
Troy, you,
that.
are we talking about the same thing? You clarified that the 10% does not apply to what we originally thought it
Space,
applied to.
right, right. And I just realized that late in the conversation. I would have clarified that earlier, but I was looking at it closely and I'm like, well, wait a minute, that only applies to the drive aisles.
Okay, that's fine.
And then in my prior experience, typically that's where we would see the request is for the drive aisle spaces.
Makes more
And
sense.
usually it's specific to a certain location. It's not the entire parking area. And that's how I would approach it. But the way this is written, it just says 10%. So.
Okay. All right. So commissioners, does anybody feel strongly to believe it'd be appropriate to ask about the long-term parking instead of 8 feet, right, Troy? Is there
So,
something?
yeah, so currently by long-term parking, you can do up to 20% of a parking lot that is long-term parking with compact stalls.
Okay.
So that's to say, a long-term parking lot can have 20% of the stalls 8 feet wide.
8 feet, not 9 feet.
Otherwise, yeah, in that instance, 80% would have to be 9 feet, or if it's just a standard parking lot in a retail or any non-long-term, all of the spots would have to be at least 9 feet wide.
Okay. Is there anybody that feels so strongly that they don't want 8 feet that they'd suggest? And if so, it needs to be specified what width you would specify, still up to 20%, unless you want to change the percentage that can be long-term parking as well, either or both. Does anybody feel strongly about that? Enough to say, instead of 8 feet, it should be whatever, and instead of 20%, it should be whatever.
I guess I would make it easy. My perspective is it's a nice idea, but causes more problems than it's worth. So I wouldn't change it. My perspective would be remove it.
To have no long-term parking provision?
Yep.
By that, you mean the compact spaces table would just go away and it was just standard spaces? Is that what you mean?
Yep.
Yeah.
I'd agree. I'd feel comfortable with that.
I'd have to disagree, sorry. And I know I'm not voting, but the reason why I have to disagree, I agree with what Scott said, is if I have two different people coming up and asking for something to change, and you allow one person to go 7.5 feet, another person go 7.8 feet or whatever versus what it says here in the compact. I'm having a difference all scattered all over through the community as opposed to the uniformity that we're trying to have.
This still has uniformity. You have the one table there. You just don't have the compact table.
I agree with Renzo, but I think let's simplify. What we're talking about is pulling out any smaller, any standard at all for long-term parking. And so I'm agreeing with Renzo's objection to what you're suggesting, only because, again, I think it is good. Staff has, as I think they should, has been proactive in trying to address this, understanding, again, it can be changed at some point. But I think it's good to have something in there, as evidenced by the fact that we don't have anything at all in there now. But if you want to propose that it be eliminated, and we have the votes, we yield to the majority. Wendy?
So we put something in there, some standards for long-term parking and then the private. And Marty, you said something like, I think it's more trouble than it's worth. Can you elaborate on that? I'm just curious.
Well, if we label things compact parking, I think most people don't even know what a compact car is. I mean, somebody in a mid-sized truck probably considers that compact compared to a full-size truck. And what happens is people ignore it anyway, and they park there, and it just causes a lot of problems, I think.
Yeah, I think the concern I have is we have a lot of proposed multifamily construction across the way here, behind the town center, over near the Peanut by the elementary school. If that all goes ahead and they build all of that, then we're gonna have those kinds of issues with parking. It's gonna be real tight over there. And I think that's where these standards really come in. And I agree with you, Lorenzo, on the modifications, particularly in dimension G and F. That's backing up into the roadway, and you know, the chances of hitting somebody behind you is relatively high.
Do we have let's say we have a provision for long-term parking. Does this body have the authority to say, you know, we don't, and the developer wants to have 8-foot parking spaces instead of 9-foot parking? Do we have the authority to say, no, we're not going to do that? Perhaps they're going to build just on the other side of the fire station, and we recognize that we might add to the problem out on the street out there. Do we have that authority? So if we have the long-term standards, we can say, no, we're not allowing that.
I think we do have the requirement of so many parking spaces per so many units,
That's a number.
but this would go on another dimension and say, and those parking spaces have to be a minimum
At least
size.
this size, right?
I mean, you could have a whole lot of parking spaces that were too narrow to fit in, and that wouldn't work.
So there is still an ability to do a town council waiver under certain circumstances under 2915-3, and there can be a departure from standards including design, location, and access to parking. So if you did not have an exception for compact parking, I think that the procedure would be to ask for a town council waiver if somebody wanted to reduce the minimum parking width or size.
Clarify that, Carolyn, please, meaning if, and I'm not saying we would want, I'm saying, could we say, no, we're sorry, but we're not going to allow it to be compact parking? Even though I realize, lest I be a hypocrite, even though I realize the wider the parking space, the more likely they're going to park on the street. But I'm just asking in general.
So if you adopt the code with the compact parking provision, then I do not think you would have the discretion to tell a particular developer, even though you can have compact parking, you can't really have compact parking.
Okay.
If we remove that, then there's no authorization for anyone to have compact parking. So the only processes would be a town council waiver, or if they're amending an existing plan, then there are some administrative modifications that can be authorized up to 10%.
And I think if you looked at like a condition of approval, again, you could probably specify the location of where they are, or they're signed or marked, but you couldn't just say, no, sorry, if you kept the compact in, as Carolyn said, you wouldn't have that ability to do that.
Carolyn, I'm going to try and move this along. Am I correct? I should be asking if anybody wants to make, commissioners want to make an amendment to the proposed land use code to say we're removing from the staff's recommendation any reference to long-term parking, and see if we have a second and a majority vote.
I think you could just ask for a motion to approve right now. And if someone wants to make a motion to approve the change, except for the change of adding compact parking in 5.8.19.2, then that could be the motion.
Yeah, even as I asked you, and I'm going to come back to, I'd rather hear, can we get that, will that pass? Then, okay, that's my discretion, right?
Well, I think if somebody makes a motion, you know, you'll know if it passes, I
Yeah.
think, yeah.
Okay, so I'd like, one of you who feel strongly about this want to make a motion to, we're not amending we're amending the proposal by the staff to remove the long-term parking. So does anybody want to make that motion?
I'll make that motion, Phil.
Okay, do I have a second?
Well,
I'd like to hear.
Yeah, I was going to make the motion that we adopt the guidelines in the standard vehicle table and delete the compact vehicle table and references to long-term parking. And I'd also like to propose that we delete the asterisk, the 10% modification
Well,
allowance.
hang on a second. You got to take them one at a time here. And I'm not sure I want to make sure the first one, I thought from this side of the table, what was being suggested was there be no reference to compact parking.
right. What he just said.
That's
Okay.
what I was trying to say.
Okay.
If
All
I
right.
didn't say it,
That's how you're.
that was what I'd like to propose, Phil, if I
Okay.
can.
All right.
Right.
Okay, is that what you're looking at? Okay. And then as for the 10% variance, that only applies to that applies to something else. You want to tackle that as well? You want to tackle it separately?
I think separately, because I guess I don't support that one. I would want that one in there.
That's where I was headed. Okay, let's.
Okay, so
tackle
let's
the
go with
first
the
one.
motion
So
and
you
we'll
made a
leave the
motion
asterisk in.
to remove long-term parking, but with the more expansive language.
Yes.
Okay, do I have a second?
Second.
All right. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay.
Nay.
Okay, carries on a 3-2 vote, correct? Okay, so we've removed that. All right, now let's tackle the variance, the 10% variance issue. Tom, you want to start with that one again?
Sure. I'd like to propose that we delete the 10% variance asterisk on items F and G in the table.
Okay, at this point, I'll ask, is there any further discussion? Because we had some discussion about that, not enough. Marty, do you or anybody else have any further discussion on that one?
Mhm.
Okay, Tom's made a motion to delete the 10% variance provision.
Second,
Right? Do I have a second on that?
second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor of removing of Tom's motion and Marty's second, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay.
Nay.
Okay, I believe it does. The motion does not carry on a 2-3 vote. Okay, with that, now, absent of any other further discussion, do I have a motion on approving the overall recommendation of staff on the parking standards
As amended, right?
as amended just previously?
Motion to approve item 7A as amended previously.
Second.
Sorry, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, the overall motion carries as amended. Thank you all. All right, we're off to a blazing start here.
Trying to take the clock down.
Yeah, that's why they took the clock down when he's right.
Parking's always
Okay.
a long
At
topic
least,
here.
at least we started earlier than usual. Okay, we're on to 7B, Building Color Land Use Code Amendment. Troy.
Okay, this is a proposal to add a subsection in table 5.3 relating to building color. Currently, you can see the diagonal image is the current code. 5.3.4.2 materials section, it has a section A and a B. And we're talking about adding a section C that in this A and B, it talks a lot about building materials, but it's real silent about colors of those materials. In our Harmony Corridor standards, we have a section that applies only to the Harmony Corridor on color, and we thought it would be a good idea to have some standards about color that applied to everywhere else in town, not just the Harmony Corridor. We did take this issue to the community outreach meeting that we have for each of these code changes. And the version that we brought to that meeting had are encouraged rather than shall as kind of the language. And there was a lot of suggestions in that conversation that if we used shall, what we were worried about is that planning staff would then have to be the color police, and we didn't want to set up that role for the department. But there was suggestions that perhaps the planning commission could grant a variance to the color standards if it was deemed appropriate. And so this version uses the term shall, but then it also has a provision in this last sentence that gives the planning commission the authority to approve an alternate color treatment if they determine that it would meet the intent of this subsection. And really what we're trying to accomplish is to avoid inappropriate color choices that impact other property owners. And that's a pretty hard to pin exactly down what that is. And so this language in blue here is our attempt at that. And I think we've kind of captured that. I mean, it's really the effort to try to have diversity in color without allowing it to get to where it impacts, other property owners. And so we're open to suggestions if you think the wording ought to change, but I think this covers what we were trying to accomplish anyway.
I am opening it up to public comment. Grant, okay. 3 minutes. All right.
The one with the
No.
voice, the mouth with the little voice thing coming out of it.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Now it's on.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, I'm Will Welch. I'm the program manager for Ladera. My address 7785 Highland Meadows Parkway, Windsor. And just to get to the end, and I'll explain why, what we're going to ask for is that regional commercial be removed from this discussion. We feel like by including this in the regional commercial zone, for the reasons that I'll talk about here in a minute, is just going to require constant trips in front of you guys, and we're going to end up coming back and PD overlays and the whole deal. So just for a little refresher, regional commercial in the code, it says located solely at or near interchanges near Interstate I-25 and arterials, RC regional commercial district, facilitate an appropriate mix of regional commercial uses such as large retail establishments, business and light industrial uses, medical facilities, offices, higher density multifamily residential, and a continuum of care. Under the comprehensive plan, it says centers of high economic base located near regional transportation corridors, providing regional commercial services such as restaurants, grocery stores, theaters, and retail. These areas support retail and employment in more suburban development patterns, yet provide an intensity of uses served both the town and the larger region. The whole regional commercial is going to have a variety of uses that are going to be next to each other. We're talking, I kind of did a quick survey right now. We're projecting that we're going to end up with maybe 30 plus national retailers that come in. They're going to come in, they're going to have their branding that they've got on 100 stores in process. The wording of the code change talks about, we want low reflectance, subtle, neutral colors, whereas the Ladera design concept is built around, we want a comprehensive color. We want good design. We feel like this is eliminating the opportunity for the design review committee that the town is going to participate in to do good design. I think it is going to annoy the retailers. We've already had some experience with a national retailer who came in. They are super engaged in their branding that they've done 100 times everywhere. And so we're going to constantly be asking for PDO relays. We're going to be constantly asking for changes. The other thing that I think will happen with this newer language, where it talks about coming back in front of this commission, is we're going to take time. One of the things that the retailers are really focused on once they get to this point is time to market. And to sit there and say, okay, well, now we got to go another month or however long it takes to come back and get a special approval, they're going to have a hard time swallowing. Let's see, what else did I want to do with that? Oh, I guess the other thing that I think we find a little troubling is, you know, the statement of the intent of the subsection is to prevent negative visual impacts caused by inappropriate color choices. You know, I was at the swimming pool over the weekend and I saw some guys in bathing suits that I thought were inappropriate. and so I think that does sound like you're trying to be the color police. And so again, what our ask would be, if you do this in any of the other zones, that you, as part of an amendment to the proposal, that you eliminate regional commercial, because we believe we'll be back here a lot talking about it. Thank you.
We wouldn't expect anything less. Okay, we close the public. All right, we have another speaker. As long as you're not going to repeat the same thing, please.
Verbatim, yeah. Grant Nelson with Con LLC Ladera. One piece I'll just add is we do have a design guideline at Ladera. We have invited the town to sit in on that design guideline. We have color palettes that you guys can review. The reason the storage came before you guys in the condition it did is because we kept rejecting it, and we were the color police, and we kept sending it back and telling them to start over and get it better. So by having the town and this design guideline in place, we feel like we're already doing what your intent of this language is. So that's why we're asking that regional commercial be exempt. So.
All right, I'm going to get to the bottom of it. Thanks, Grant.
You're welcome.
Or we're going to get to, okay. We've closed public comment now. Staff, can you speak to this? Can you speak in particular what discretion Planning Commission has? And I'd also I keep hearing about this Ladera Design Committee that we're going to have an opportunity to participate on, and have some skepticism about it, but that's perhaps unfair. So speak to the use of that committee and also what discretion there is in this matter.
That committee, correct me if I'm wrong, meets once a month, and as this is the second month that town staff has been kind of part on that schedule, they haven't had any items on the agenda yet, but there's been 2 months where we were ready and available if they did. Chad and I both are invited to that, and we kind of both jointly review all of the Ladera applications currently, and so I don't know a whole lot yet because we haven't had any architectural review proposals in the last 2 months since we've been invited to those. But this week, Monday, was going to be one if they would have had an application, and so it's just basically I think the first Monday every month, like in the mid-afternoon, and it's an online Teams call.
Right. Well, help us with us with the main issue here, the contention that our friends from Ladera made to the effect that there is a certain branding. Help us with that first, then we'll bring it up.
Yeah, this is sort of a delicate balance between what is overly restrictive and what is just right, and a lot of these words leave a lot to be interpreted. But at one point we did have neutral colors in the text, and I think we've lifted that out of there. I'm just reading it through again. I'm not seeing that anymore. But it's basically low reflectance, on the main body of the building, and then anything that's shiny or especially colorful reserved for trim. And that may or may not, be something that would conflict with what the Ladera, buyers would want to do. They're right. They do have these, standards within Ladera, their design standards that are pretty rigorous. And like Grant was saying, they do a pretty good job policing for things that are, not in character with what the rest of their vision for their development is, particularly with colors. So I guess it's sort of a judgment call. But currently, just Harmony Corridor is the only place within town that has really any color requirements on buildings, and so we thought the rest of the town should have that same kind of scrutiny. They have a good point that maybe they're self-policing enough on the color, but that is really kind of a judgment call that ultimately you'll be recommending to council whether you think that is good enough for the RC zone or not.
Okay, I want to come up here and see if anybody else is going to go where I'm going to go, because I don't like to go first. But first of all, I am going to say one thing. Among a whole lot of things at that public forum that were I don't necessarily agree with, and Commissioner Newland was there as well. I did agree with taking out encouraged and putting something else in. I don't know if shall is the answer. I think shall is probably better than encouraged. I thought that was squishy, to use the gentleman's word. I agreed. That was probably too squishy. That's not a scientific term necessarily. But so I will say in regard to that particular word verbiage, although I'm open to suggestions, but with that said, commissioners have added here on this overall overarching issue. Go, Renzo.
Yeah, sorry. So I
On mic,
definitely
on
am in
mic,
favor
please.
from a residential standpoint. I do recognize and what the gentleman brought up, because that was part of my concern, is I feel that we could turn off people, businesses from wanting to locate because we're not having or allowing them to maintain their branding. And branding in the business sector, we all know that is extremely important. We've been successful as a committee without regulating that it applied to them, to ask them to tone it down. And in many cases, they did. And I just encourage us to maybe continue with that approach. But when it comes to the residential, again, I think it's really important there, because there isn't a branding there that we have to concern ourselves of. It's whatever that specific family or individual would have. And then one last one, if I may. In the statement, it says that you want to eliminate fluorescent colors and neon tubing. Does that mean that the car wash has to take down its lighting, and the fire station and the police station have to take down their rope lighting?
Yeah, why don't you answer that and then
Well,
speak to his.
they're already existing, so,
Well,
that wouldn't apply to,
Those aren't neon.
but yeah, it says fluorescent colors.
but they're
So that-
fluorescent with LED.
Fluorescent colors is not necessarily illuminated. It's a color that has, that's just super bright, in a neon color standpoint, but, neon tubing illuminates, so I guess, those rope lights aren't specifically called out on that.
He said they're not neon, and that's.
Yeah. But neon, as far as building, colors is, I suppose, different than like a neon sign in the window that says, Budweiser beer.
So
That
this-
falls under the sign code, yeah.
This isn't preventing that.
This would
This
prevent,
neon
this is the
colors.
building, yeah.
Yeah.
So if it's like a
Right.
permanent part of the building,
So answer this for me, to Renzo's point. I didn't, when I saw this, well, I didn't think our intent was to prevent branding type coloring in commercial developments. I didn't think that was your intent at all. Is that?
no, I don't, that wasn't our intent. I think it's if, you know, it gives us some discretion to point out something that seems obnoxious to both staff and ultimately the commission, beyond what's reasonable. And it gives us, you know, right now, we don't really have a lot of teeth to say, you know, that's too much. This gives some teeth, but it also gives a lot of discretion because the wording here leaves a lot to be interpreted.
So can this-
I,
Go ahead and then.
okay. I think the intent, you know, we live in a very beautiful part of the country. We have very beautiful natural landscapes, and best practice in this region is to harmonize with that and blend in. And so most land use codes have, you know, muted natural building color tones. Branding can be accomplished through signage. That's a beautiful application. And so it's just like, let's let the buildings blend in and not overshadow our natural landscape. And that's the intent, really.
Would we, by the way, I've been meaning to say this is a good opportunity. We had a lot of discussion whether Dutch Bros blue was too bold, lack of everything. And I went by there after it got painted, whatever. I think it's very attractive. I think it is, whether that was staff's doing, but would we have, if Dutch Bros was in Ladera or anywhere else for that matter, would we have approved it? Again, I go back, I don't think it was our intent to prevent the branding. And I also don't necessarily know if I agree, so I'm hedging my bets here, whether signage for branding is sufficient. If a building color is part of the branding, it should be considered as long as we have the discretion. Second part is, while I have the floor, is this design review committee, in the staff's opinion, sufficient to hash these things out? And how are any ties broken? Whose discretion is it when you sit down, when we do have something for consideration as it goes to what we're looking at right now? How is it decided if staff still says, well, we don't think that's right, and Ladera says it is right, or any other developer?
I don't think we can comment because we haven't been through that process. So we don't know if it works or not. I think we're optimistic that we'll be able to work through all of these things with that process. The Dutch Bros example, so we did work with them. Initially, they had a lot more blue and it was a lot more prominent. It was on the pillar. And so we wanted them to tone it down, and they did. And now it's a lot more balanced, and it doesn't really stick out as much. And so I think under this language, that would be okay.
And would you have, and it worked out. It's very attractive. So Commissioner, anything else in this vein? Because I got an idea.
Just on that point, I mean, this sentence right in the middle of this paragraph says the use of brighter, brilliant colors or glossy finishes shall be limited to use on building trim and building accent areas. And I think building accent areas is what Logan was just talking about. They, instead of it being, you know, the prominent, it became the accent.
Okay.
You know, the use of the bright color.
Yeah.
And so that there's an interpretation there that, you know, first staff will make, and then ultimately the commission will make on, you know, whether that accent, whether it's an accent area or if that goes beyond an accent area when they're using a brighter, brilliant color. I think that's kind of the crux of what we're talking about right there.
Okay, so I go back to the original question. Was it or was it not the intent of everything incorporated in this amendment to address commercial businesses such that the standards may run counter to the branding within reason?
No, that was not the intent.
Okay, that's good. I suppose that wasn't the intent. So are we comfortable that we weren't intending to their point? Or are we comfortable that we had a meeting of the minds tacitly because that was not our intent? And if not, I have a suggestion. Does that make any sense? Do you understand what I was getting at? In other words, do we not have an issue here as far as?
I
I mean,
think
as far as their suggestion on the RC zone?
Yeah,
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, most likely, like we were talking about, we'll sort this out in that design review meeting and, you know, Grant and will probably not, bring us something that we think is beyond, you know, reason on this, but if we exempt them, then it's, you know, it doesn't give us the opportunity to, you know, veto that, I guess. I don't anticipate they would come a lot with that. I think we would work it out internally, probably on almost every occasion.
well, we would certainly,
effectively, but-
yeah,
but
that, haven't
really
used the
comes
word
down to
compromise in a
veto
while.
power, I guess.
We would certainly hope that happens. Because what my idea, far-fetched though it might be, although it makes sense to me, is to approve everything else in here, but with the understanding that we're going to defer on the RC and see how once this design committee gets going, see how that goes. Hope that there's a meeting of the mind and it comes to us saying, hallelujah, we've compromised on something so that you're not, as Will said when he first got up back here repeatedly, more letters from you know who. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Well, here's my perspective is it's fine to say here tonight, it wasn't the intent of doing this, but does it mean anything? Doesn't really, right? And yes, Ladera has a design committee. We can't guarantee the next development will. And we've also seen twice in the past where somebody comes in the absence of standards, we say, we want you to make this change. And they say, no, we met the standards, we don't want to. So having something in place is better than nothing. That gives us something to go back on when somebody doesn't want to compromise, which has happened twice. That said, you know, brands go deeper than a sign. You know, so, you know, it's the building, it's the color of the building. When you look at a Texas Roadhouse, you don't need to look at the sign. You know what it is. So if there's a chance that this is going to interfere with that, then that's an issue as well. So you need some standards, but, you know, you can't, you know, you have to allow, you know, In-N-Out's going to be a white building. You can't interfere with that. Otherwise, why would they come here? You know, and having everything uniform where you can just change the sign is a strip mall, and we don't want that either.
Back to you.
I can think of an example on one, years ago, I was a planner for the city of Fort Collins, and there was a branding auto parts store that wanted to just have a glass box as that was their brand. But fortunately at the time, the land use code had standards where you had to have articulation, of the facade. You had to, show columns, you had to, there was a lot of things that a glass box couldn't do. And, they complained a lot at first, but ultimately it was, do you want to have an auto parts store here or not? And they did. And so the building, looked a lot better than any other auto parts store that I've ever seen as a result of having standards. And so that's sort of the question about branding is, to some degree, you might scare some retailers away. To another degree, if they want to be in the town bad enough, then at least you don't have a bad looking building as a result of having higher standards.
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is having standards is good, but how do we ensure they're not so prescriptive that it just doesn't make sense?
I guess I don't think this will squelch any sort of branding. This language is not super prescriptive. It does leave the opportunity. Essentially, we're like, we don't want a neon pink building if that is in your brand color. So I think there's still ample opportunity to brand through their building design and through color.
And we have discretion, correct? We have, the planning commission has discretion.
To the extent that, yeah, most of these, like, for example, that word, building, or the term building accent areas, that is what can't be, bright or brilliant colors, or, no, that's what can be. So it's like the main body is restricted from bright or brilliant colors, but the accent areas is fine. Right. So how big is an accent area? It leaves a lot of discretion up to staff first. You as a recommending body, is that too much or not? It's not a quantitative measure. It's a qualitative measure, I guess. So that leaves a lot of discretion.
And the exceptions. So exceptions to this go to you.
Okay, but do we have the discretion to say, we think this is going, whatever it is going beyond your reasonable branding, and we want to reach some compromise?
Well, it would certainly depend on the specifics on a case by case basis of what they're proposing, but
I understand that.
yeah. I think it gives the discretion to say, yeah, you are beyond that by pointing to this language. Particularly like if the way that they're going beyond is bright, too many bright and brilliant colors. I think we've got the teeth for that. And there's this language about, seeing this, like the second sentence, colors on the main body of the building shall be low reflectance and complement the surrounding area. So complement the surrounding area gives a lot of latitude as well. Goes back to what Logan was talking about.
And I'm coming down to you, Renzo. Hey, to Marty's point, I agree with you that we should anticipate the next thing that comes along, whatever that is. I think somewhat we may touch on that in 7D. We're going to at least talk about that in a broad context. I guess the question I would ask is, are we necessarily, by not being broadly prescriptive, are we necessarily erring and opening the door to further problems down the road? I don't think we are necessarily, but I'm at least smart enough to ask this question.
Leaving too much open for interpretation?
Yes.
Is that what you're asking?
Well, you see where I'm coming from on that?
I think so, but I still, we need some standards, otherwise, hard to push back on anything.
Okay. Renzo, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Phil, because it's right there and it's like the fifth sentence up. It says, exceptions to the color restrictions may be approved by the planning commission, if the commission finds that a proposal or by the planning commission. And I believe it needs to be a period there and the rest of the sentence struck to achieve exactly what you were asking. And that is, could the planning commission override a decision that was made as a result of this?
Exactly. I knew
And-
this was there. I wanted to,
But by adding the rest of that, we're restricted on what we could do. And you want to be able to have basically the veto power. And I think that's right.
read, where would you put the,
What I would do is say exceptions to the color restrictions above may be approved by the planning commission, period. The rest of the sentence is struck.
Well, the rest of the sentence was an intent to give you some criteria by which to gauge whether or not it's appropriate to grant an
But we don't
exception.
want the criteria.
I don't know. I think you're on the right track. I don't know that we lose any flexibility by having the rest of that in there, but I can be convinced if that will help move this along. Wendy,
So this applies to regional commercial. Off the top of your head, or do we have a map of other places in Timnath that are considered regional commercial? I don't have it in my head, but there
Well,
may be people out
currently,
there
I
that
believe
want,
it's
are
it's
curious.
Walmart and Costco and all of the undeveloped parts of Ladera.
That's it.
I
There's
think
some
currently
regional
that's it,
harmony.
but it's not to say that there won't in the future be more regional commercials, annexed and zoned
Okay.
in other areas. But there's not a whole lot that in our future land use map that is designated for that, but there's some in other locations that could become, future
Okay.
zoned that way.
are any other wordsmiths out there that see value in Renzo's suggestion or otherwise?
I think it makes sense.
Okay,
Staff, does it?
so I do like having some standards in terms of what you're considering. So, I mean, if it were planning commission can grant exceptions for circumstances when changes are consistent with the branding of the commercial user and do not negatively impact the surrounding properties. We could also draft language and come back to you. It's always easier than probably drafting on the fly, but I'll leave that up to you guys.
I agree with Carol and I agree with overarching. I prefer standards. I think Renzo's on the right track. I just don't know that, I think the first part of the sentence is the important part. That's important. And I don't think that the second part, without cutting it out, I don't think that necessarily restricts or broadens the intent of the first part. The important part is there is discretion. But I agree, I don't think that, I think that we're talking about prevent negative visual impacts caused by inappropriate color choices. That's kind of like encouraged. It's a little too squishy. Help me.
I guess I would ask this, Renzo, what's that second part there? What's bothersome about that to you? I just want to make sure we're all reading it.
No, and that's a fair question. It's when I read this, it says, if the commission finds that a proposed alternative color treatment would in fact substantially meet the intent of this subsection. So what that's telling me is it's possible that they denied the first color, which is their branding, and they want now a different color or a different approach. That's the way I read that.
Mhm.
I'm okay with it because I think, and Carolyn makes this point, and this I may not necessarily be right on point, but if we're going to suggest a change in something, we have to suggest an alternative. So I think we're splitting hairs here And I don't think we're necessarily taking away our discretion by leaving that second part in there. I wish there was some way to make it a little stronger or to make it more definitive, but I don't know that there is.
If I may, let me bring in your example of Dutchboro. When they came in, they wanted their blue sign, they wanted their blue background. And they came in front of the planning commission because they were at odds a little bit with staff and wanted us to help mediate, if I recall correctly. So they came in with the color and asking for that particular color. What is the alternative color that we would propose back to them?
I guess the way I read this though is Dutch Brothers, what they came in here with was the alternative versus what the staff, right?
Yeah,
So-
it says alternative color treatment.
Yeah,
So that could be a
not-
different area.
Yeah, not the color itself. So in the Dutch Brothers example, the way I read this is we can approve it. We can approve what Dutch Brothers was proposing, which was different than the staff. We could approve what the Dutch Brothers proposed because we thought that substantially met the intent of this subsection.
Versus what the staff was asking for?
Exactly.
Got it. Okay, if you read it that way, that makes sense.
Is that?
Okay.
I read contracts for a lot of years, so I somewhat speak legal.
All right, so I'm going back to I'm going to first ask the staff, I'm at least smart enough that I can't reopen public comment here. If this was a site plan, we could certainly do that. In fact, so if it was not the intent entirely that we would be terribly restrictive in RC, and you're comfortable with this, and/or we can see how this much touted design review committee works. And I saw heads nodding on both sides when you asked the question. We would think that there will be compromise such that it doesn't necessarily come to us to have to adjudicate it. Commissioners, are we comfortable advancing this one? So we can.
As is?
As is.
Yeah.
I had one question on the materials where you had some words that related to roofing materials. That's in the subsection 4-2.
I'm not changing it.
It's kind of the next paragraph down.
That was the same as before.
You mean up
wasn't it
up
changed,
here?
right?
Oh,
Yeah, the
is this
bottom
where
it
you're
says,
talking? Yeah, that's the existing code language.
yeah, I'm a little concerned about prohibiting things like steel roofs and fiberglass roof. We really haven't had a huge hailstorm come through Timnath and ravage everybody's houses. But I have lived in places where that happened, and a lot of people went to shingle-like fiberglass and shingle-like stone-coated steel, which is much more hail-resistant than traditional asphalt or composition roof. I think we need to make sure we're not excluding those newer materials if we do get a hailstorm come through and damage most of our houses.
Are we excluding those? And by the way, we have had.
It kind of, the words kind of suggest.
We
that.
have had it. We have
Yeah,
had
I think
freaking hail
the,
damage.
generally speaking, the material, section is pretty antiquated. Like we haven't kept up with innovations and
Right.
building material. And so we will be looking at that.
So that's
here.
some other day.
Mhm.
All right, fine. No other questions.
All right. Commissioners, any reason why cannot ask for a motion on 7B so we can move on to the fun stuff? No? Okay. Do I have a motion on the staff's proposal, 7B on building color land use code amendment?
Motion to approve item 7B, building color land use code amendment.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. progress. All right, do we need a break?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask one for.
Okay.
Please.
Anybody wanted a break? Go ahead. We'll take a very brief break. thank you. Everybody here? Okay, moving on to item 7C, building height land use code. Also Troy.
Good evening again. This next code revision is an attempt to substitute what we had always measured building height in feet with now measuring it in stories. And there's various sections of the land use code that this affects. The 2.9.9.10, we've got a table 5.2, and we've got language in 5.5 and 5.63 and 5.93. And this is the handout that we handed out earlier. Since we sent out the packet, I started diving into these diagrams to kind of give some visual in this PowerPoint show. And as we got into the nitty gritty, it seemed like maybe we still needed a little bit more refinement. So that's the reason for that. But I guess the first question is, why would we change from feet to stories? The first reason is when the average person visualizes how tall a building is, they don't think, what's the difference between 45 feet and 55 feet? They think, well, how many stories is that building? That's kind of the common intuitive way that, most of the population thinks about building height. So we sort of wanted to be consistent with that so that, these actual feet regulations becomes less of a thing, and how many stories is it? The other thing is the building codes actually, much of the regulations in both the IBC and the IRC, International Building Code, International Residential Code, refer to stories of buildings as well. And so it, we thought it'd be nice to be consistent with that as well. So really what the crux of this is in table 5.2, we have a column for building height, and it goes through each one of the zone districts, and it calls out the maximum building heights. And instead of in feet, if you can see in your packet, or let me go back up again. So you can see in your packet, there's the table 5.2 summary that just talks about how we would substitute those feet that are listed with stories. And so you can kind of refer to that draft language, that draft code language in that handout. So I just want to sort of dive in. So the residential zones, including any residential within the agricultural zones, so that'd be A, RE, R1, R2, R3, and R4, all have 35 feet as their current limitation. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, and we can, as we go through the other scenarios, I think we can go a lot quicker, but this first scenario, I'll settle some of the ground rules of why these drawings show and what they're showing. So the current code is over here on the right, and so a building is measured from the base, which they define in the definitions, up to a point that is halfway between the peak of the roof and the eave overhang, and that is currently what the 35 feet is limited to. Now, when it's a flat roof, it would be up to the top of the parapet, but on a pitch roof, that's what it refers to. So we're talking about having instead three stories to substitute for 35 feet, and so we're defining what a story is in these definitions, and you can see that in kind of this draft language. And in this section 5.6.3, it's the section on measurements of building height. And so we're getting into the distinction between how big is the maximum size of a residential story versus a non-residential story. And so I'm first focusing on the residential stories. And we looked at a lot of other codes around, and Fort Collins and Denver both have some of their buildings regulated in feet, and I believe Boulder also has some as well. So we sort of borrowed this 12 feet, 8 inches from Fort Collins, since they've thought this through years ago about what is the reasonable maximum that you would expect a residential story to be. Now that is 12 feet, 8 inches is a lot taller than you would typically find, but what is, this is just as big or as tall as a residential story could be by definition. And so we borrowed that definition. And if you applied that, you had 3 12 feet, 8 inch stories, you would, to the top of the top story, you would have 38 feet. So that's a little bit more than 35 feet. And that doesn't include the thickness of the roof. And that's sort of on purpose in that when we're talking about, the population would visualize a 3-story building, they count how many floors there are. The roof itself is sort of typically not a factor within, when a 3-story building is talked about. You don't talk about whether it's, how tall the roof is typically. But this diagram on the left is probably the more typical of what you'd see. So for example, residential, particularly when it's single family houses, you'd have probably a 10-foot ceiling on the ground floor and 8-foot ceilings on upper floors. So factoring in the floor height, you'd probably typically see an 11-foot ground floor to floor, and 9-foot upper floors. And so, you'd ultimately have 29 feet on a typical 3-story house. And so even though you could make it up to 38 feet, this 35 feet that we're changing it from is somewhere in between, this maximum that you could potentially get and the more likely scenario of what you're likely to see. And so just going through that on the zones that allow 40 feet, we've introduced this concept called a half story. And that's another thing we borrowed from Fort Collins, that they've defined what a half story is. And we've modified what our definition of a half story is from them. And I know other communities around the country have also used this half story, but it's basically when you tuck living space up in under a sloped ceiling within sort of attic space. And so the way we've defined it is you can have sidewalls up to 4 feet tall, and then the slope needs to start from that exterior sidewall. And if you do that, then you have a half story. And so the 4 feet of sidewall counts within the building, within the height when you add it up. And then you've got the 12 feet, 8 inches maximums. And so for a 40-foot, what was 40-foot, if you did the maximum, you could get up to a 42-foot, but the more likely would, be somewhere down in the 33-foot range plus the height of the height of the roof. So we're pretty close in, I think, going with a 3.5 story to translate from what was 40 feet. So that's the residential zone districts. And so I'm going to jump then to the commercial zone districts. And first we started thinking in terms of this diagrams for commercial, but before I get to the commercial diagrams similar to those residential ones, we thought of this exception that really was sort of important, and it's in the RC zone, which obviously we talked about earlier, and is the where Ladera is and Walmart and Costco. And so we looked at Walmart and said, well, they've got a 1-story building, and currently, if you look over here on the left, I'm just showing that part of the table that is our 3 commercial zones, the NC, CC, and RC. And the distinction is the NC is the shorter 30-foot currently. The CC zone allows 35 feet, and the RC zone allows 40 feet currently. So we're trying to translate that into stories, and that argument of adding up the individual stories works for when you have multiple stories, but if it's a one-story building, and then using Walmart as the example, you can see that, you know, they've got 32 feet up to the top of this parapet, and then they've got their little roof on their entry element above that. And so we added this green sentence, so basically no story above the ground level story of a non-residential building can have 13 feet in vertical height. And so this doesn't have any upper. So this is saying, so this sentence, I'm sorry, let me back up. I'm talking about the first sentence here, is that, hold on a second, let me read this again. Right. So, okay. So this last part of the sentence is saying that in the regional commercial, you can have up to 40 feet. And, the intent is that you can have a Walmart or a Costco, type of a store, and it's a one story, but you're not restricted to, otherwise we were talking about the maximum, like ground floor ought to be 25 feet and no more than 25 feet. But if you only have one story, and you have you ought to be able to have that be taller. So that's what this language is trying to do. And the other thing is Shields as an example, that sporting goods store. It's a two-story building, but it's not, it's in a scenario where a taller building, it's not like it's probably 50 feet tall, for example, right? And so in the RC zone, we wanted to be able to have a two-story scenario like a Shields that was at least up to 40 feet. And so this second sentence is trying to allow for that. So if you have a two-story building, you're not limited the same way as if you have a 3, 4, 4.5 story building. It's a different animal. And this sentence is attempting to allow for that exception. So you could have something like either a Costco, Walmart, or a two-story like a Shields up to the 40 feet in the RC zone, or up to the 30 feet in this NC zone. So that was sort of the intent. And then moving on, we did that same sort of analysis on when it gets to be the 35 feet as when we're, for example, the commercial that's in the RMU zone and the CC zone. This is kind of when you have multiple, like 2.5 story buildings, this is what the regulations would be. And again, that's, I've got the maximum you could possibly have would be 42, but the more likely that you'd have, it would be more like 32. So that's kind of the change from the 35. And then when zone districts that would otherwise be 40 feet, this is what it would sort of translate into in these diagrams. It would be 38 feet would be what you'd probably more typically see in the stories. It could potentially be up to 51 feet. But again, that's the maximum if all stories were the maximum height. And again, in the zone that would otherwise allow 50 feet, which would be the industrial zone, this is what it would start to look like using that same formula. So the other exception is in the agricultural zone. Going back to like they had residential was 35. And then it said agricultural building 50 feet. And the way that we dealt with that was just on this revised handout, just to say that barns and that agriculture is 3 stories, except that barns and silos are exempt, because those would be the tall things within agriculture that, would otherwise have had the 50 feet. So that really concludes my presentation. If you've got any questions, be happy to answer.
Public comment. What a surprise. Okay, Will. You're up. See if you can keep it to 3 minutes, please.
Yes, sir. And I have a bunch of questions because one is and I've been doing this a really long time. This is really hard to figure out and follow. And so I don't know how, if you had an architect from Omaha that came in to look at this, you're going to hand them this and say, go figure it out. And so that's one of my concerns. I guess one of my other concerns is it seems to me that a lot of these definitions are at odds with the IBC, which is the building code. So now I'm being asked, I think, my question is I'm going to do a site plan that's going to have buildings calculated one way, and then I'm going to do building plans for life safety that the building's being calculated another way. And then when everything gets approved, if there is a problem, what governs? And so that doesn't seem to be addressed. And one of my questions was, did y'all talk to the building official about this? We already have some projects that are kind of similar to some of the things that he's got up there right now. We've got one that may have an entry feature that's flat, maybe 60 feet wide, but it goes up 15, 20 feet above. So that doesn't get measured at all. The question, you can't answer me, I know.
Go ahead with the rest of your
Okay.
questions and then
Similarly,
Come
we've
back.
got a building that's a big footprint that in the middle of it, it's going to have a clear story window structure on it. I don't understand how that gets measured. And so, and again, some of this is, I'm baffled by it all. And so, we're always worried about the retailers. We've got some people that are coming in that have clear stories. We've got an athletic facility that the first floor may start pushing some of these issues with the 2-story that they want to build. It just, I don't understand why the specificity. I do a lot of medical, and in medical, I've got some that the first floor is 20 feet because I've got ambulatory surgery centers in there, and I've got duplicate utilities running through those ceiling spaces. It's just, you're specifying a lot of hard stuff for projects that every single project's a prototype. So I don't know how you deal with that. So.
okay, that's okay. Thank you. Want to, well, of course.
Well, Grant Nelson again. I guess the 3 minutes we're given is 3 minutes, but
No, go ahead.
we've spent 6 years working on this and been in front of you dozens of times, right? A lot of times. We've been in front of you 3 times talking about height for a hotel and for a retailer. I guess just getting to the point that none of these heights work for us. It doesn't work for Ladera. It doesn't work for commercial. Entertainment users, the theaters can be 45 to 50 feet in a single story. There's 2 entertainment users that are looking at Ladera right now. They're 45 feet in a single story. We have multiple retailers who have 42 to 49 feet in 2 stories. So as Will said, the prototypes are all different, and branding is part of this. And the retailers and the entertainment users' ability to display their branding is critical. And if they don't get it, they just don't come. And going to Troy's comment before that they had a retailer or a auto parts star that wanted to go to Fort Collins, so they made them change the prototype. Maybe that's what it was in the past, that you really needed to be someplace so you'd bend. The retail world today is we bend, they don't bend. The blue is too blue with Dutch Brothers may have worked one time, but if that story gets out, the other retailers are gonna be like, how hard is this town to get through? And the other comment I'm gonna make, and it's not necessarily in your purview, is this town is a 2-legged stool. It has a town council and a planning commission, which is great, has an engineering and a planning department, but you guys are missing economic development. Economic development doesn't exist in Timnath. If you survey the communities around Northern Colorado, economic development does exist, and it is very, very vibrant. I just came back from ICSC, and I saw the Johnstown Economic Development Director. Fort Collins calls it something weird like economic vitality or something. Loveland was there. They are all there trying to attract retailers to their community. Timnath is not represented. As the person who has brought in 90% of the retailers to Timnath, the third leg of the stool of economic development goes between engineering and planning and makes sure that it works for economic development, and we're missing that. So the
Grant,
3 minutes that we get doesn't really
I
fit.
get it. You're right. you're right, but that is well beyond our purview. And I understand more than you know.
It is.
I
These
I
changes
attend
that you're
council meetings too.
proposing.
Yes, but that is beyond our purview.
Yeah, well, these
For-
changes you're
way
proposing though
beyond-
do take a swipe at economic development. They hurt economic development. We went with Scott, Will and I did a couple weeks ago, and he said these weren't aimed at you. So again, we would ask that Ladera and the regional commercial, not just Ladera, but regional commercial not be affected by these height limits. Because otherwise we're gonna be right back in front of you guys with the fitness user, with these other users, making pleas to ask for the change as opposed to going under the rules that we annexed under, going under the rules that we agreed to when we annexed the property.
I understand. Okay, let's give the staff, I want to give them a chance to address. It
Thank you.
certainly will. Yeah, thanks, Grant. Just first of all, Will's concerns about the
Yeah.
confusion.
We're thinking that the PD overlay that they have approved already would sort of override the new adoption of these height standards, but we didn't specifically, we're thinking that now as we're reacting to that. We would need to read through that in detail.
Okay, I'm going to bring in our attorney now for a moment because I'm referring back to a couple meetings ago and
Well, and I guess
Yeah.
I would say
you see where I'm going.
the definition of story, I get the context of where they're coming from, but from what we're looking at, it actually provides some flexibility where one of the things that we constantly hear is the codes aren't flexible. So it's a little ironic that we're getting feedback that stories doesn't provide that that flexibility that the intent was trying to give a little bit of flexibility in height. One of the challenges with a hard number sometimes comes in enforcement and sometimes comes in what is built. So there have been instances in my prior job where there was challenges to a height of buildings that literally came down to several inches. So I don't know what the remedy is in that situation. We wouldn't obviously require a building to be torn down because it somehow magically became 40 feet, 2 inches too tall. So again, I think the way that the stories have been used in other communities does provide a little bit of flexibility in that hard number of total feet in height. But I think Carolyn's looking at the PD overlay, but my understanding is the PD overlay as Ladera already had their height dealt with, and that would be true for other PD overlays in the community. This would be for areas that do not have PD overlays currently adopted.
Yeah, when I saw this initially for the public comment session, and interesting, there's nobody here offering public comment on this. I mean, I thought this was a good thing, and I thought it very much tracked with the direction we had gone with the hotel, the direction we had gone with the unnamed retail sporting goods. And I thought this very much would be, and if there's confusions, that's another thing. But I thought, and as I believe it was Michael who mentioned at the time, and I thought it was pertinent, given the discretion we had, that the Ladera site is the lowest point in Timnath. So if there's any place that something higher, if discretion is allowed. So, I mean, I thought we plowed this ground before. As for the enacting a land use code amendment, I thought our attorney had passed judgment that if something wasn't in process, then it was subject to the new standards. But on balance, I really welcome this, particularly, and I thought Shields was a good example. If we could get a Shields, I recognize that going with stories made a lot more sense to us. So help me with this. Aren't we talking the same thing here?
Yeah.
So, I guess I don't have the PD overlay in front of me for Ladera, but it did include a specific modification of height in terms of feet. So I would think that that probably would. Just in one place. Oh, just in one place.
Just along the lakefront there.
Otherwise, it was just what the code allowed. Okay, thank you for that clarification. So in that case, if it was not modified under the PDO, this would apply. Now, when you talk about an application in progress, there's a lot of new development that's going to be coming in that's not in progress. So they haven't actually had a specific application for a specific user. So yes, it could apply to PD overlays, and it could also create. Yeah. Questions?
Move it, didn't do it. So are we are we on the same page, or are we not on the same page with
I
the
think our
value of
intent is
going
on
to
the same
stories?
page. Yeah.
Just hang on a second, the value to both the town and this developer and perhaps others, in looking at stories, first of all, that seemed to make more sense. So are we precluding any, within reason, any potential commercial enterprise that might have it as part of their branding, part of their design standards? To our,
Well,
to our detriment.
Yeah, our intent was and that's in this sentence that maybe needs a little bit better wording in hindsight. But the intent is things like shields that are up to, the size that you'd normally get in measured in feet would be allowed here, or things like a Costco or a Walmart or a grocery store. These
theater?
1 and 2 stories.
A theater?
Health club. The intent is that this wouldn't get in the way of those happening in Timnath and also in the Ladera and the RC zone. This is one zone in the town, and so the question is, part of the question is this going to stories appropriate everywhere else? And then if yes is the answer, then is this our one sticking point? And maybe it's a matter of wordsmithing this paragraph to more successfully not confuse the reader. It sounds like what Will was saying is he's not quite sure how to read that and how his retailers are going to read that. But if we eliminate measuring by feet altogether, then and we go with stories, then there's got to be a way we could word this paragraph that accomplishes allowing these retailers to have a little more flexibility than just the foot. And that was what Scott was alluding to, having the exact foot called out versus if you're 2 inches above, if we go in stories, that's not going to be a problem. So maybe it's just a matter of this one paragraph referring to that scenario of 1 and 2 story buildings in the RC zone needs a little more work, and everything else is fine.
And may I presume that is not something we can do on the fly right now?
Well, you could certainly just have this not apply to regional commercial. But additional changes, I mean, anytime we're making changes, I think it's helpful to, continue it and allow staff to actually think through and draft the changes and come back with a
That's exactly
recommendation.
excuse me, that's where I'm getting at. Pardon me, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I guess I should have not, perhaps there was a double negative in there. I guess what I'm asking is it better to continue this and have you come back with, if you're acknowledging that, whether it's a further meeting within reason, to come back with better language?
Well, if you choose to do that, it would be useful to know if it's just this RC zone in these 1 and 2 story buildings that the concern is, or if it's the rest of this table that also there's concerns with.
I have a
so that we
feeling
have.
Marty can speak to that. I'm just guessing.
So the way I take it is, I think a majority of the concern, we haven't even gotten to the residential yet, but the concerns here, I can see it is, I'm not in this industry, but I had to read it a few times and I'm not sure I understand the whole stories thing. I mean, from the summary presentation, I take it that, it looks to me like everything gets higher. Everything allowed is higher than what it currently is, which, but I see the point there. It says right here that single story can only be 30 feet, so a theater, that would preclude that. So I think, this whole thing, I think would benefit by maybe going through it, and, taking the specific concerns. There was also the one, not going to pretend to remember or understand, it was this code versus whatever the builders or whomever would use, that it's different. So taking into consideration, health club uses, which is probably, could be more than 25 feet, just the specific uses they brought up, the difference between this code and the builder, that maybe would benefit from more vetting.
More flexibility, I think, is better, is
Yeah.
it not?
Yeah, and like I said, we haven't even got to the residential yet. I mean, my main question in that was, do we want 3 stories in residential? Now, if that includes daylight basement is the 3rd story, okay, but we don't need 3-story homes in residential. Maybe multifamily, but not normal.
Renzo.
So I too found this very confusing to read. And there's no doubt that for residential, stories make sense. For commercials, it just doesn't to me. And that is residential, we always look at residential as stories. You either have a single family, 1-story ranch, then a dual or even a 3rd story. Very seldom, but even a 3rd story. But on a commercial, you don't know what type of building that's going to be. And all of their tools, their CAD tools and all that, is capable of measuring in feet. So it's easy for them to be able to design the building, convey, hey, this is 38 feet, and that's what I'm proposing. Am I in guidance or not? And I think for commercial, it's appropriate to keep it in feet.
And on the residential piece, since you're on this one, is the way I read this, just doing some quick math. You have the 35 feet that's allowed now for residential. The maximum possible, the middle scenario, is about 1/3 taller. And do we really want that in residential? Because I mean, with the way I read this and then kind of saying what the roof would be, it's, you're at.
Yeah.
Somebody
If
could put a
if
real
all 3
depending on
stories
what
were as
inches
tall as you
it
could
is.
make them, yeah, which
Yeah.
is
Yeah. And then the whole, the
possibility,
whole,
but not likely, yeah.
and then the whole aperturance, I'm not sure I'm saying that right. It sounds like that's not even measured at all. So somebody could put a big steeple there and we couldn't say no.
Steeple on a house, yeah. I guess
No,
most
on a house or on a business, they could put something, radio tower or something.
Widow's Walk.
So, that one is one I didn't make a lot of sense to me of why we wouldn't include that in a maximum height. So I think, there's a lot of questions here.
There are.
Yeah, I worry we made the whole thing unnecessarily complicated, and I'd go back to feet, not stories.
Well, and maybe it's the narrative around it that makes it complex that we're just not understanding too. Not, it's just, if the narrative is, kind of hard to understand, then we don't get the concept of what you're trying to do.
I think we also need to think about what the impact, you might unintentionally make everybody, focus on flat roofs or really peaked roofs in order to get things higher or lower. Do we really want to encourage that?
Which gives the greater flexibility in the commercial so that we do not discourage something that we would want to have in a and I'll add the caveat, in a particular location where it would be more acceptable than other locations? Which gives the greater flexibility, feet or stories?
Well, I suppose it depends on how you do it. Our intent was to make it more flexible using stories. Potentially though, this attempt didn't quite do that from what the feedback I'm hearing.
I don't know that it doesn't. I still,
Or it's just
again,
confusing, so it's not.
I
not
agreed
clear
with it
what it's doing
initially.
To the reader.
I'm just wondering if, what, I agree that it was an attempt to have more flexibility. I clearly saw it as understanding the need for sales tax revenue. I understood this gives the greater flexibility to get a business that, for any reason, branding or otherwise, needed to have that flexibility.
I think if we go with straight feet and then use the PD overlay as a tool for people who want something higher, that's what we're doing now, and I think that's appropriate. We have the flexibility to make something taller if we want to. We just have to go through that step of an overlay.
Carolyn, was that a head nod?
That's exactly what I was thinking, is that, you were saying, well, what's the process for if you want to exceed it? So one is a PD overlay, and you've seen that in the case of Ladera, where they made the case that, okay, because the elevation was lower, they should have a higher height limitation. So the other one would be a waiver, and I'm just looking that, give the criteria for a waiver.
Waiver being distinguished from variance, right?
Exactly.
Still
These
don't
all,
know the
that's something that we're planning to come back to later this year, and these all relate to,
Oh, good.
the town play, let's see. Town council waivers. A waiver can be granted. Okay, I don't see height as a reason for a waiver, so I think it would
I
need
think
to be a
that's because
variance.
there's a height bonus
Okay,
baked into the code
of 10%?
already. I think it's 15%.
It's that first, yeah. 2.9.9.10. Currently called a height
Yeah.
exception, and we're proposing to change it to height modification or height minor modification.
And just a general comment, I think it's good to have a more flexible, adaptable zoning code, base zoning code, just because, and we'll get into this a little on the next item, PDOs are really difficult to administer, especially over time, and they're stuck in time. And so we want to get away from doing so many PDOs. We want our base land use code to be able to facilitate development without having to take that extra step. So just food for thought.
We're going to address that next
Hmm.
if we don't run up against my doctor's appointment tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Here.
So I guess to your point, I know me, I'm not opposed to the stories. I think it's just what was in here was very hard to understand. So I think we're not at a point to be able to understand the concept of it to see if it's a good idea or not, or more flexible or not. We're just not seeing it.
Are you suggesting we continue this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of questions, right? There's so many questions. I just can't see us coming to an agreement on what we'd even modify if we don't know, if we don't really understand the base concept here. And also, out of the gate, there's at least 2 or 3 projects that just wouldn't fit in this already, which isn't a good sign.
Yeah, a general comment is I don't feel comfortable voting on it. I feel like I have insufficient knowledge or understanding data for a meaningful vote.
I think the basic premise of more at least commercial, more flexibility absolutely, I believe we concur on, but given this confusion, it would seem to behoove us to continue this.
Given the rule on the continuance, do we have to set a date?
Yeah, you can either table indefinitely, or if you're not interested in this amendment, or you can table it to a date certain. Now, you could also counsel, I guess I'll ask your planners for a recommendation of how long it'll take them to come back to you. They could also republish, and then they could just republish and bring this back, but a continuance means they don't have to publish the second public hearing.
We've continued, although it's really staff decided to continue things. We haven't exercised this privilege, but which is less cumbersome. I certainly trust staff to, if we continue it or whatever the verbiage is, at whatever time they think they've got this sufficiently nailed down to come back. So do we have to set a specific deadline?
You could table it and then not set a date for them to bring it back, and then they'll just republish.
Well, I don't know Bob's rules, but I don't like the word table because my understanding of table is as a commission, you have to vote to pull it off the table for us to bring it back to action. So, but again, I think the intent is if you were to continue it, we would work on it, we would republish it and move it forward that way. That would be my preference rather than picking a date. Is if you're not happy with it, please submit your comments, questions to staff. We can work on it and we can fold it into another round in the not so far distant future.
I think that makes more sense.
Yeah.
Okay, do we vote on this?
Yes, you do need a motion to continue, and we just won't do till what date? Just a motion to continue until staff brings it back.
If there's no other concerned about this, do I have a motion to continue?
So moved.
Item 7C, building height land use code amendment. We have a motion. Do I have a second? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We're continued on this one.
How do I?
All right, moving on to 7D, plan development districts, land use code amendment. Logan.
Sorry, just a second.
Okay, our favorite topic, plan development districts. So as we've come to learn, our land use code is a conventional zoning code. And sometimes these are really crude, they're too rigid, they make it kind of difficult to create these mixed use integrated developments. And so that's where the PDO comes into place. So we refer to it as negotiated zoning, but essentially it's created by layering on or superimposing additional regulations to alter, which is add, delete, or modify the standards of the base zoning district. And except as modified by the PDO, the requirements of the base zoning district still apply. So this allows communities to achieve specific planning goals that might not be feasible under our base code. But these shouldn't be used to simply reduce requirements without a clear community benefit. And so they were originally intended to create these creative, context-sensitive developments. And what we've been seeing is they've been used to kind of as a de facto variance package. And they don't really correspond to public benefits or design enhancements. And so we feel like they've functioned less as planning innovations and more as a customized variance package. And so that really can compromise urban design and walkability, the quality of our public realm. And then it confuses the regulatory precedent. So if they are broad variance packages, that somewhat undermines the predictability and intent of our zoning code and what residents expect. So I had the pleasure of combing through a lot of PDOs. So if you don't know, every subdivision in Timnath is a PDO. And just kind of categorize some of the deviations or modifications that I observed that were coming up. So open space requirements, our standard code requirement is 25% of the gross land being subdivided is required to be open space, and most PDOs reduce that significantly. So that implication is less accessible open space, more impervious surface, smaller gathering spaces. Another one, transparency glazing, which is windows. Ours is 30% on the ground floor of that retail. And a lot of PDOs just eliminate that or reduce that. So that reduces the street level activity and walkability. Facade articulation, so we require no more than 50 feet of unbroken plane. And so that should be interrupted by projections or recesses. And so what we've seen PDOs do is increase that to a significantly higher number or linear feet, and then include that facade planes can be interrupted by color or material change. So not even a plane change. So that creates non-dimensioned blank walls, reduces interest and human scale. Parking requirements, that varies based on the use, but typically we're seeing an increase of approximately 20%. So that encourages overparking, greater heat island effect and stormwater runoff. Parking maximum. So our code has parking minimums. That's the minimum number of parking spaces required for a specific use. And to kind of safeguard the community, we have a parking maximum. So you can only exceed that parking requirement by 125%. And if you do exceed it, there's some mitigation. So you have to use pervious pavement or pavers. So a lot of these PDOs are increasing that bonus to 150 plus without that mitigation. So again, encouraging overparking and runoff. And then tree diversity, we are at 25% of any species. That's being increased to 40% or unspecified. So just a greater risk of monoculture failure. So when you receive these packages, it's like a package of 35 modifications. And each one in isolation may seem pretty insignificant. This is like a slight modification, not too bad. Well, I wanted to just go ahead and do the application. Like, what does this look like on the ground? And do the math. So I picked just a fictitious 100,000 square foot retail store. So think half the size of Walmart. And I employed 4 modifications. So parking requirement, I went from 1 space per 300 square feet of building to 4 spaces for 1,000. So that's about a 20% difference. I upped the parking allowance from 125 to 150. I changed the interior landscaping from 20 square feet per parking space exclusive of landscaping islands. So currently our code, landscaping islands are in addition to this required landscape requirement. And then I modified it to say inclusive. So you can go ahead and count those landscape islands in that requirement. And then just the landscape island frequency. So 1 island per every 10 spaces is currently required. And I modified that to 1 island per 15. So there's the numbers on the bottom, but the kind of takeaway is interior landscaping area was reduced by 44 to 45% across all those scenarios. The landscape islands are reduced by 32 to 33%, and the PDO allowed for an 80% increase in total parking spaces, which that is about an acre of added asphalt. So you can see this is just one site, and the cumulative impact of site after site after site can be pretty significant. So here on the left, you can see that's similar to what our base zoning code requires. And then on the right, that's what we get with a PDO as they've been approved to date. So that's Costco on the right. So our current review criteria, we just felt like we needed some more robust standards to actually get that public benefit in return for the flexibility we're allowing. The current review criteria really just speaks to more efficient development, which may contain, not shall, innovative or creative development. So I would say from a developer's perspective, the picture on the right would probably constitute efficient development. So proposed review criteria, we would like, there to be, again, more robust criteria to qualify for a PDO. And so the benefits of any flexibility to our standards need not just to benefit the applicant or a single project. And they should equally or better meet the intent of the code. They should implement the comprehensive plan beyond what can be accomplished with the land use code. And then we put in some criteria. So multimodal, environmental performance, improved amenities, better integration of all elements of development. And then we also would like them to have a PDO, to have a neighborhood meeting. We feel like this is just as important as a rezoning. And so that meeting is important for the public. And then I believe, there's a size threshold. So this really can't apply to any sites under 5 acres. It needs to be a significant piece of land for this process to apply to. And that is all I have.
Public comment, open public comment, 3 minutes, please.
Am I on?
Yep.
Oh, I'm good. Okay. My name is Sherry Welch, and I'm the manager of Connell LLC with the address of 7785 Highland Meadows Parkway, Fort Collins, Colorado. Here, obviously, to talk about the PDO changes and probably how they relate to Ladera. Totally understand what is being proposed and what they're looking for in getting some of the public benefit. I guess our concern is we have been in front of you for 4 years now. And we did PDO amendments based on what the plan is. As there are making changes to the underlying zoning, we might have the need to come back for some other PDOs. But I would say most of what we're doing right now is more of a precision strike and not an overall change. I mean, it would be coming back saying, we have this use, and so here's the use, and we've been short of totally disclosing users that we can't come out with, are saying, here's the benefit, this is what you want. And I've heard tonight that we don't want to limit economic development. The sales tax engine that we have is the most important to Timnath. If we're successful, Timnath is successful for paying for offsites, onsites, doing all this. However, we've already given the town a lot of significant benefits. We already built Weitzel, 3 years ago at no cost to Timnath, and it's just been sitting there. We've now developed put 4 months ahead of time, the new traffic signal. So I guess part of my question is, if these design criteria come back, if we need to come back with a PD overlay that is, like I said, this precision strike of what's going on, are we going to get credit for what we've already done for the town? Or is everything like a new bar to kick up to? Because right now I think we've done the development, and frankly, we don't have that many, we have one project under construction right now. So I think that needs to be taken into account for the PDO changes. We will probably need a couple of PDO changes just for, like, say we have an entertainment user and it's above the 42. Come in, we have been very upfront on saying that, but needing to hit some of these other standards, I think the overall Ladera development already has, and we need that to be taken into consideration. Now, that might be different from PDOs, what they're doing everywhere else in the town.
Thank you.
There's a theme I go second every time, as you can
Sure.
tell.
As long as you don't get into economic development director again, it's not in our purview. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. As long as the clear community benefit to the PD overlay is the economic benefit. I guess that isn't addressed in the planning documents, right? So that's one of my questions. Carolyn said earlier, the PD overlay is the only mechanism that we can change the code, is amend the code. And frankly, the code isn't great for retail. Logan's slide that she put up there comparing the two. Well, the one that she did showing the 1 per 300 and the landscape articulation, that's non-developable real estate. You can't park a retailer at 1 per 300. You have to park at 4 to 1,000. The landscape in the parking lot, 1 per 15, parking island 1 per 15 is low. That's actually very low. 1 per 10 is silliness. I mean, just frankly, when we did the Walmart, we had to amend the code. When we did the Costco, we had to amend the code. When we did Ladera, we had to amend the code. As we go forward, we're going to have to amend the code. So setting the bar really high on PD overlays makes it that much harder for us to bring retailers and quality commercial development to the town. So this is our biggest issue tonight, in my opinion, that changing the way we go about PD overlays makes it very, very difficult for us. And we will be back in front of you over and over and over again. And I don't have a clear answer as to whether a clear community benefit is the economic benefit to the town. That would be my question. And again, we've been here 5 years. We've been in front of you a lot. We've brought PD overlays. We've tried to be very surgical about it. We tried to be very open about why we're asking for what we're asking for. And adding new layers to how we need to jump over this fence, it doesn't feel like this is the way we should go about it. We appreciate the staff working with us. We have tried to develop a good relationship with the staff. I think further communication, further articulation of what we need, what the town wants, is how we can work these things out. This is how we can use this design review committee to solve some of these problems. But setting up PD overlays to be more difficult just makes it more difficult on the applicant, and then the applicant as the conduit to the users. And the last thing we want to do is scare away users. Fort Collins has scared away users for years, and that's why we have this opportunity that we have. So let's not put ourselves in a box by making this harder than it needs to be. So
Thank you.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Staff, back to you.
So, PUDs and PDOs are used throughout Colorado. And I think early in communities' development trajectory, it's like we want anything and everything we can, right? So regulations are pretty loose. And then as they start to get things, they start to dial it up a little bit. Okay, we want more quality development. And that's kind of a common trajectory for a lot of places. So we do have some large retailers in, and so this is just a policy question of, do we now want to have that quality? You know, we don't want to sacrifice the quality just to get anyone in. And so that's kind of the purpose.
I do want to also point out, based on some feedback that we heard from the meeting, that we did add a provision so it doesn't make it as cumbersome to amend a PD overlay. So under section 291411, we did provide 3 scenarios. So it does provide a pathway or a ramp that's maybe not as much of a burden on the petitioner to go to both Plan Commission and Town Council as it currently is to amend a PDO. So there's kind of 3 scenarios where it does allow a little bit of deference to dealing with minor changes to the code, state law changes that we could just do it at staff level. There's a different tier that would just come to the Plan Commission, which is new. You all have heard me talk about this before, and with my Town Council, one of my goals is to start integrating more Plan Commission approvals and staff approvals rather than everything going to Town Council. So that's something, a goal of mine, that that is incorporated into this proposed change that is new. And so I do think that's something that is another policy question, because currently now all PD amendments and proposals have to go both through Plan Commission and Town Council. So this is another change that where I think the petitioner or the public comment was talking about some strategic or surgical type changes to their existing PDO. That this might create a pathway where it's not as time consuming or burdensome to them, that could either be dealt with at staff level or Plan Commission. So just wanted to point that out in the policy. So
Thanks. And I was thinking that along, can you clarify though, elaborate a little bit more and clarify how amendments to the existing PDOs work? You mentioned three different options and you touched on it there, but clarify it for everybody's benefit here.
well, currently it's goes to, first they have to get through staff where we work with them on the language, goes to Planning Commission for your recommendation, then goes to Town Council for any change. In fact, recently we just processed one dealing with height. And so what the code also does is put a shelf life on PDOs or whatever we want to call them. So if it's existing and valid and current, one of the things, for example, this functional turf bill that just got passed with the state, any new site plan that comes into their PD, we have to comply with the state code. And rather than forcing them to go through a process of, hey, you got to go to Plan Commission and then the Town Council to change your PD to be consistent with state law, we can just do that at staff level. That's what's being proposed is, or if there's a Scribner error that's referencing the wrong section of code and we're kind of in a dispute between what section of code is it actually referencing. So that's the first tier that's more of an administrative level of approval. The second tier is some minor changes to the standards that again can be brought to Plan Commission. And then if they're proposing new changes or more drastic changes to the existing PD, then it would be your more standard process where it goes to Plan Commission and Town Council. So what I would see is in that second tier, whatever standards that they currently have, if they're changing or tweaking those, we would work with them. But if they're proposing new ones, then it would be the typical process. So that's where I think, again, this is recognizing the challenges with the process to approve these. And in those first 2 scenarios, they're not necessarily having to meet the prior criteria. They're not adopting a new PD overlay where they have to meet the qualifications of that sense because they're just amending the existing PD in that sense.
I go back to, thank you. I go back to the issue of transparency. And I ask this in the context of the 3 that you suggested, and you said if it's more drastic, I think or substantial, whatever, it would come to Planning Commission. Does this, and knowing how transparency is particularly important to staff, certainly to council, approving things at the staff level, particularly if it adds the kind of flexibility that we're looking for and we talked about with other things tonight, sounds well and good. Are we crossing a line though where we're not adding the kind of transparency that I know council favors? And it's not a loaded question necessarily. I'm just thinking about that very concept as it relates to their obligation to the public.
I don't, just approval process doesn't necessarily equate transparency. There's a lot of forms of transparency. It could be communication. It could be announcements. We have the development newsletter you sign up. So any administrative approval, we could just say, hey, was approved. This is the standard that was changed to dealing with that. So, trying to define what transparency expectations are, I think it would meet that metric of transparency, of just awareness of what administrative changes were approved per the code, being consistent with state code, or again, clarifying language within the existing PD that maybe conflicts with the standards in the code. So
maybe I'm naive. Administrative approval, you're saying, adds flexibility, greases the skids, safe to say. And is it possible to be able to run that by planning commission so that due diligence has been done in extending then the administrative responsibility, or is that gumming up the works? Essentially, you could say, might as well have brought it to planning commission.
it's your discretion. It's a policy question. I mean, if you don't think that's appropriate, you can change it to your purview or not administrative. In my purview, currently there are current processes that are administrative with the town that don't go before land commission or town council. So though there are processes that do happen, they're pretty minor. And again, I would see this as a instance that are very minor and there's no substantive change in the PD. But again, that's a policy question before the plan commission. And town
I
council.
understand.
And again, town council would be considering
Carolyn,
the same thing.
Do you see where I'm coming from? I'm trying to weigh the obligation for transparency. I'm also suggesting that I'm asking a question at the same time is, are there thresholds of what is appropriate to be administratively approved, considered and approved, or approved versus what needs to come forward to planning commission so that it has an element of transparency?
So when you approve a PD overlay or really any of your development approvals, or when council approves them or you approve them, usually the language of approval set authorizes staff to make minor modifications needed, such as to correct errors. So what's being proposed is just allowing very, very limited staff approval, which is just to correct an error or when there's, an ambiguity in the existing PDO, or when, again, they have to do so to comply with state law. So it's pretty limited. But certainly if you wanted to, leave it at just correct error and take out ambiguity, you could. So that's where the policy comes in about what do you want to see. But as Scott pointed out, there is already staff authorization to make, for instance, modifications up to 10% and improve plans. And there's other places where there is administrative approval of changes that are even more substantive than what's proposed here. So it's trying to streamline that process for the developers. But certainly I could see examples where maybe if it's ambiguous, you want it to come back to you.
Well, streamlining, help me, colleagues, streamlining seems like a real good idea for everybody. But a certain level of oversight too. I'm just trying to weigh the obligation here. But if I have to err on one side or the other, streamlining sounds good. I think if it's understood that if there's any question at all, whether it's beyond clearing up ambiguity or something similar, then it probably should come forward.
And that language is included in there. So
Is
if
it-
there's a situation where I don't feel comfortable with that, then at my discretion, I can punt it on to Plan Commission in that first tier scenario, that administrative level.
Commissioners, what else, what other questions do you have about this? But are we first and foremost, counter to what our hopefully still friends in Ladera are suggesting? Are we in fact actually kind of looking back at a couple of these other things? Are we in fact improving the system? Are we in fact streamlining?
From the sounds of it, with the changes of an existing plan, I think we are. And I think to his point
On the mic.
is right.
I'm sure there's still lots of
And-
thousands of people out there tuning in.
Sorry, I thought it was on. And to his point is, it really is just an administrative if it's a change. If it's more serious than that, then he punts to step B, which comes to us. And even in the first case, if they do make a change, he says they'll report that out. So we'll be able to see that when that's published as well. So we'll get insight into it, but maybe not the approval at that stage. And if we find that it's involved, then we have to make a change from there. But I mean, we're trusting staff to do other things, other approvals. And as Carolyn mentioned, they've got approvals that are more serious than this. So we ought to trust them in this one as well.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I've got a comment, Phil. I think his point about economic development was actually spot on. And I think we need to make sure that the goals and objective of our comprehensive plan and maybe some of the criteria that you have to meet include some sort of an economic development criteria. We don't have that right now, and maybe we should.
That's fine. But that's not within our purview.
I understand, but if we're gonna evaluate all PDOs based only on these 4 criteria, I think we're limiting ourselves.
Well, I think you're talking about two different things there, but go ahead, Carolyn.
It would be in your purview to say you'd like to add a different additional criteria to section 5A. So so then it'd be E. So if you wanted to add a criteria for consideration of, bringing economic development to the town, or, sales tax revenue or growth, or however you want to define that adding an additional criteria would be within your purview.
That's a given. That you talk about public benefit, economic development, we're talking about generating sales tax, but creating an economic development position that is well above our purview. So yes and no.
Right. I think Tom was talking about the criteria, if I
Right.
understood the
The
comment.
final sentence where it says you've got to meet 2 or more of the following criteria. Unless the words better integration of all the elements of development include economic development, perhaps it does. I don't know how to interpret that.
Yeah, I can see that if you're saying that doesn't cover that first and foremost, we're interested in economic, I'm gonna put the end result in commercial enterprise that brings sales tax revenue to support the quality of life that everybody wants. Yeah, I can see that. I don't know that it's not covered by that, but if that would be helpful, we can certainly put that in there. But I believe I know the distinction between what you're going down, and I apologize. But in what Mr. Nelson was suggesting. But yes, if that's appropriate, and maybe it is, but I think it's a given that that's what we're looking for.
If that's a consideration, we did say 2 or more. So if you're adding another one, I would suggest that you'd say of 3 or more of the criteria. Since we're doing a menu approach, I don't want to lessen our menu by just adding more, and then there's just one choice left.
Well,
So
maybe that's a good question for staff. Does better integration of all the elements of development include economic development?
No, that was more physical improvements. So
Yeah.
does the streetscape integrate?
If we got
this-
another Costco and all the economic development from a Costco, it would be worth a little bit more runoff from the parking lot, maybe.
Yeah, certainly there are environmental trade-offs to be weighed in the long term. But yeah.
You could plant a few more diverse trees.
So staff, is there value in order to move this along? Is there value in adding words to that effect? I would probably opt for economic enhancement to something, but I'll leave it up to you to suggest the language. And to Scott's point, yes, you'd have to change the number.
Yeah, I mean, again, if the commission wants to include some component of economic benefit or enhancement to the town. My personal opinion, I don't think sales tax revenue is, it's a hard measure, how much sales tax, what is it generating or benefiting over time? So we're in the process of updating our comprehensive plan. So with that process, it's going to identify some broader goals of economic development so that we could tie some of it back to that language and could amend it moving forward in regards to what economic development means for Timnath. But again, I think it's a perfectly fine criteria to include. And
I think it would help balance some of the other criteria like multimodal development. If we're going to get transit into Timnath, we need to have a whole bunch more sales tax.
What verbiage would you suggest adding to this to meet our colleagues' suggestions, assuming everybody concurs, not just because we're getting tired?
well, Carolyn might differ otherwise. I would recommend that that the motion include 3 or more of the following, and staff draft, I guess, the 5th criteria to encompass economic development, that we will have that language for consideration for town council to consider.
I'd be okay with that.
I don't like drafting things on the fly. It just never works out very well.
I agree. So I think that's a good solution. Commissioners, other thoughts? Janelle?
So I understand that the bar to getting a PD overlay is going to be higher, but I also heard that making amendments to existing PD overlays, some scenarios would be more streamlined. Is there a case where amending a PD overlay takes more steps or has more requirements than what we have in the code today?
All of the above.
Maybe leave it dark.
It really depends on what they're proposing, I think, in the 3rd scenario. So depending on what they're proposing, if it meets the criteria, then probably not a heavy lift. But if it doesn't, then I think that's where it might take longer to get through staff and plan commission and town council, if that makes sense.
I think so. So can you repeat what the neighborhood meeting requirements, where did those fall in?
So that is table 2.1, the hearing process and notice requirements. So for typical rezonings, you're required a neighborhood meeting. That was not required for this process, so we just included that.
So to be granted a PD overlay, you'd need to have a neighborhood meeting. To be granted an amendment, would you need a neighborhood meeting?
No.
Okay.
No, just for a new proposed PD overlay.
Okay. Thank you.
I don't see a big problem with the neighborhood meeting, but trying to envision, will they get it? Will the concept of the PD overlay is, we struggle with what it means, what it doesn't mean, at least I do. do you think is a neighborhood meeting, is it going to work? Is it going to, or is it create more problems for the staff and the developer?
I think it's just one more opportunity for transparency, you know. And the hope is to explain it to them and get them to understand. And staff does attend to those and is available for questions.
Anybody else see where that's going, in terms of, because the PD overlay is synonymous in some people's minds with variance, and some people then, well, why do you keep, there are those who say it should be very black and white, and we understand that is not feasible at all to have, I'm just trying to drag this out a little bit longer just to make it work. Am I all wet here that the neighborhood meeting? I yield to your judgment, but does anybody agree that it may not be necessary?
I think it is necessary. I do think that being transparent and open, it helps. There's a lot of people that really don't pay attention to what's going on in town, and then unless you advertise it, they won't know. I think a lot of people were surprised by the opening of Timnath Parkway when it happened just over the weekend. So I think that there's a lot of advertising that go a long way. On the other side, we want to make this a predictable process for the developer and try to take away some of the risks. There are some risks in public meetings because you're going to get a vocal minority that's going to complain. So I think we need to balance it and make sure our public meetings are run in a way that are predictable.
Well, the latter part of that is exactly where I was coming from, where you're talking about something that this is a fairly complicated circumstance that I don't care necessarily one way or the other, but I thought it was an issue worth raising. If staff thinks it's worthwhile, but it seems like an additional burden on everybody.
Yeah, because I mean, it depends really what it is though, right? I mean, if it's like one of them using 1.5-inch trees versus 2, I mean, I can't imagine ever being bored enough to want to go to that meeting, nor is it necessary. I'd watch golf and I don't like that. But
I guess the way
it really depends on what it is, and does it, in our opinion, does it matter? Does it require a neighborhood meeting? I mean, low impact things shouldn't. It's just an unnecessary burden. Right?
Yeah. Well, and I'm sorry, Scott, let me just, because I wanted to take off on what Tom said about, I can't remember exactly what it was, but if, for instance, vocal minority, we've all dealt with the difficulty of understanding whether we have a vocal minority or a silent majority. So you got, let's say the PD overlay, the amendment is height for a 4-story hotel. So we're back to that. Do we really think that anybody's going to come to this? It's not going to object, be in that vocal minority, as opposed to coming and supporting it just to get more information. So I guess I'm just lobbing out there that is this prudent?
So I just want to clarify, you had asked the question whether a public hearing was required for amendments. And as drafting, it seems to say the community development director may require a neighborhood meeting for amendments to the existing PDOs if the proposed amendment is determined to constitute a substantial change to the approved plan. So sometimes a neighborhood meeting would be required for an amendment as currently stated. And then that gets into your question, what is, how substantial is the change? Is it something the public cares about? So it kind of delegates that decision to the the community development director to determine in that case whether a public neighborhood meeting, would be required.
Well, I'm not gonna prolong this anymore. I think if staff feels that there should be a provision to do this in the interest of transparency, far be it for me to suggest otherwise. I do think it's probably setting up for further issues.
And just a quick question, who goes to these community, somebody from staff goes to these?
The project
So-
manager attends,
So I applaud you for,
But the developer puts it on.
the developer puts it on.
and then somebody from staff is required to be there to answer questions.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And in my opinion, I think this is one of the more significant processes and impactful. And I mean, if I were a resident, this is what I would want to go to.
But-
So,
Well, I for one yield to your judgment on that.
I just had one point of clarification. So we had a neighborhood meeting for, the Ladera, preliminary plat, like a month or so ago. And, they don't have a lot of neighbors and nobody showed up, but me and Chad were there, and the developer team was there and we were ready to answer any questions and explain everything. And at least there was any opportunity. But I think these changes are probably going to apply to like more new residential subdivisions that are coming in, and probably won't affect Ladera all that much because they don't have a lot of neighbors, regardless of whether they're doing a neighborhood meeting or not.
Yeah, and I wasn't necessarily thinking about, I was aware that it was sparsely, if at all, attended, which is another issue, our noticing requirements, but that's for another time. All right. Have we sufficiently?
I've got
Yes,
just one.
Renzo.
Yeah, you made a lot of changes in 2/9/14 through 2/9/14.3. In those changes, what constitutes what you were doing as normal fact finding versus just new stuff? I mean, because when I read through it, it sounds like that's the type of questions and review process that I, as a staff member, would go through when I was reviewing the PDO.
yeah, so I think we were cleaning up language and making sure the things we want to see when we review these are there.
Okay, so it'd be things that you would normally ask for, though, if they weren't there.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I want to interject one other thing, take off ME in justifying the neighborhood meetings, talked about transparency. So I'll go back to very briefly, to the how amendments to the existing PDO work. I would suggest, and again, I can't suggest a threshold other than I would say administrative discretion to move things along, to grease the skids in my verbiage, is a good thing. But I would suggest that if there's any question that it's something that runs counter to the discussion that Planning Commission had during the original presentation, or there's even the inkling that it's something that should come back to Planning Commission for its consideration, that happen. And I would presume we would very much take into account the fact that staff is making a recommendation, and I would think it would probably be, I'd like to think it would be approved, but I think it's better in the interest, as long as we're talking about transparency, let's talk about transparency all the way.
Bill, can I comment on that?
Yes.
I think those approvals might be an item that could be added to the consent agenda. That if, at least we're seeing them, and if we have questions, we could pull them off.
That's a good point, Michael, because we can always, and we've done this very seldom, if at all. I know council does it often. We then, we say, does anybody want to bring this out for discussion? I think that's an excellent idea. Staff, would that, Carolyn, that acceptable?
Sure. So the recommendation then would be for that 2.9.14.11, instead of having it administratively approved by the town planner, those would be added to the consent agenda and require approval by planning commission.
Yes, I was, and again, I'm not entirely trying to handcuff the process of administrative approval. As I sit here right now, and I know you advocate for this all the time, Carol, I can't suggest any threshold because I think each one is different. But that's why I said the best I could do is something that was a particularly noted issue during the discussion and or a particularly sensitive thing that it would seem to behoove everybody to err on the side of bringing it back, but putting it in the consent agenda.
I think that's good direction to staff, but I will say that that is going to be a little bit hard to administer because the current staff was not present for most of those approval discussions. So, and we don't have transcripts of all of those public hearings, so to know everything that was discussed or the questions that were asked. So if it was a condition of approval, we're going to know it. I was there for the, Ladera amendment, and the latest PDO approval for the southern portion of the property. But I think for a lot of our existing PDOs, it might be hard to have that historical knowledge at present.
I understand. How about this then? We understand that until such time as we catch up in real time, we bring them back. Is that acceptable? Okay. Anything else on this?
Oh, a couple things. When I was researching like PD overlays versus PDDs and things, I was talking to ChatGPT about this. And, one of the downsides on PDDs is they require extensive approvals. So I'm not overly convinced on we've streamlined things, but I think if this passes, I think it would be good to kind of more clearly articulate that with examples to council on how we balance this, that yes, this may require more approvals, but we've done this to balance that out.
I think generally speaking, this process is cumbersome. And so that's why you want like a really great zoning code where you don't need to even go through this process because it's very time intensive for the development team and for staff reviewing. So that's the goal eventually, is to have a functioning zoning code to where you won't even need these.
Yeah, but
we're not there yet.
Yeah, but you know what I mean, though, about, laying this out maybe a little bit more clear for them so they can make a decision on it. Because like I said, there needs to be a balance there. We couldn't, it can't be one-sided. The other thing doesn't really directly relate to this. It's something to just keep in mind that, one of the things we need to consider is, when we're doing these approvals, if like at one time when we were doing the PD overlay for Ladera, it was, gosh, what, 40 of these or so. We just need a different way to consider those, because getting them all at once like we did them, and it wasn't you guys, it was the previous, it's just getting them all at once. It's impossible to really consider each one, so it's just something to keep in mind, that when we get these, if there's a bunch of them, let's do it a different way.
I agree with you.
Okay.
Anything else? All right. With that, hearing nothing else, do I have a motion on item 7D, Planned Development Districts Land Use Code Amendment?
I'll make that motion. I move that we approve the Plan Development District Land Use Code Amendment as written with the addition of economic development with 3 or more criteria as part of our evaluation.
With the tweaking that language as you find to be sufficient, given what the intent is, and then it goes to council, doesn't come back here. Is that okay, sufficient? Okay, do I have a second?
Second.
Moved and second, and all in favor, say aye.
I,
Opposed? Motion carries on a 5-0 vote. Thank you all. Reports, I have nothing to report. Anybody, staff, anything? Ice cream social coming up this Friday, I believe.
Yep. Yeah, and I believe we're gonna be there to get feedback on our comp plan, so come show us your support.
Where, by the way, may I ask, I don't want to prolong this, the comp plan process this time is considerably different than last time where it was essentially handled staff and focus. We had a comp plan committee that was made up of staff, commissioners, a council member, et cetera. This is pretty much in the hands of the consultant, correct?
We just kicked it off, so right now it's very early in the public engagement process. So as we start getting initial feedback, we're just now looking at branding and logos. So like, it's literally, we're like not even one step into the process. We just kicked it off, got initial feedback from our neighbors and interest groups and yourselves. So as we move forward, we'll start mapping out public engagement and opportunities. Maybe might have some focus groups depending on which direction we want to go on that. And Plan Commission will be doing regular updates as those points and times come. There'll be presentations that the consultant will provide on the status of where we are and moving forward. So there'll be a lot of opportunities and touch points with both you and council moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Any questions about that? Anything else?